Chapter 11. He heard me out with his head on one side, and I had another glimpse through a rent in the mist in which he moved and had his being. The dim candle spluttered within the ball of glass, and that was all I had to see him by. At his back was the dark night with the clear stars, whose distant glitter, disposed in retreating planes, lured the eye into the depths of a greater darkness. And yet a mysterious light seemed to show me his boyish head, as if in that moment the youth within him had, for a moment, glowed and expired. "You are an awful good sort to listen like this," he said. "It does me good. You don't know what it is to me. You don't—" Words seemed to fail him. It was a distinct glimpse. He was a youngster of the sort you like to see about you, of the sort you like to imagine yourself to have been, of the sort whose appearance claims the fellowship of these illusions you had thought gone out, extinct, cold, and which, as if rekindled at the approach of another flame, give a flutter, deep, deep down somewhere, give a flutter of light, of heat. Yes, I had a glimpse of him then, and it was not the last of that kind. You don't know what it is for a fellow in my position to be believed, make a clean breast of it to an elder man. It is so difficult, so awfully unfair, so hard to understand. The mists were closing again. I don't know how old I appeared to him, and how much wise. Not half as old as I felt just then, not half as uselessly wise as I knew myself to be. Surely in no other craft, as in that of the sea, do the hearts of those already launched to sink or swim go out so much to the youth on the brink, looking with shining eyes upon that glitter of the vast surface, which is only a reflection of his own glances full of fire. There is such magnificent vagueness in the expectations that had driven each of us to sea, such a glorious indefiniteness, such a beautiful greed of adventures that are their own and only reward. What we get, well, we won't talk of that, but can one of us restrain a smile? In no other kind of life is the illusion more wide of reality, in no other is the beginning all illusion, the disenchantment more swift, the subjugation more complete. Hadn't we all commenced with the same desire, ended with the same knowledge, carried the memory of the same cherished glamour through the sordid days of imprecation? What wonder that when some heavy prod gets home, the bond is found to be close, that besides the fellowship of the craft, there is felt the strength of a wider feeling, the feeling that binds a man to a child. He was there before me, believing that age and wisdom can find a remedy against the pain of truth, giving me a glimpse of himself as a young fellow in a scrape that is the very devil of a scrape, the sort of scrape greybeards wag at solemnly while they hide a smile. And he had been deliberating upon death. Confound him! He had found that to meditate about because he thought he had saved his life, while all its glamour had gone with the ship in the night. What more natural? It was tragic enough and funny enough in all conscience to call aloud for compassion, and in what was I better than the rest of us to refuse him my pity? And even as I looked at him, the mists rolled into the rent, and his voice spoke. I was so lost, you know. It was the sort of thing one does not expect to happen to one. It was not like a fight, for instance. It was not, I admitted. He appeared changed, as if he had suddenly matured. One couldn't be sure, he muttered. Ah, you were not sure, I said, and was placated by the sound of a faint sigh that passed between us like the flight of a bird in the night. Well, I wasn't, he said courageously. It was something like that wretched story they made up. It was not a lie, but it wasn't truth all the same. It was something, one knows, a downright lie. There was not the thickness of a sheet of paper between the right and the wrong of this affair. How much more did you want? I asked, but I think I spoke so low that he did not catch what I said. He had advanced his argument as though life had been a network of paths separated by chasms. His voice sounded reasonable. Suppose I had not, I mean to say, suppose I had stuck to the ship. Well, how much longer? Say a minute, half a minute. Come. In 30 seconds, as it seemed certain then, I would have been overboard. And do you think I would not have laid hold of the first thing that came in my way, or life buoy, grating, anything? Wouldn't you? And be saved, I interjected. I would have meant to be, he retorted, and that's more than I meant when I— He shivered, as if about to swallow some nauseous drug. Jumped, he pronounced, with a convulsive effort, whose stress, as if propagated by the waves of the air, made my body stir a little in the chair. He fixed me with lowering eyes. "Don't you believe me?" he cried. "I swear! Confound it! You got me here to talk, and you must. You said you would believe." "Of course I do," I protested, in a matter-of-fact tone which produced a calming effect. "Forgive me," he said. "Of course I wouldn't have talked to you about all this if you had not been a gentleman. I ought to have known. I am a gentleman too." "Yes, yes," I said hastily. He was looking me squarely in the face, and withdrew his gaze slowly. "Now you understand why I didn't, after all. Didn't go out in that way. I wasn't going to be frightened at what I had done. And anyhow, if I had stuck to the ship, I would have done my best to be saved. Men have been known to float for hours in the open sea and be picked up not much the worse for it. I might have lasted it out better than many others. There's nothing the matter with my heart." He withdrew his right fist from his pocket, and the blow he struck on his chest resounded like a muffled detonation in the night. "No," I said. He meditated, with his legs slightly apart and his chin sunk. "A hair's breadth," he muttered. "Not the breadth of a hair between this and that, and at the time—" "It is difficult to see a hair at midnight," I put in, a little viciously, I fear. "Don't you see what I mean by the solidarity of the craft? I was aggrieved against him, as though he had cheated me, of a splendid opportunity to keep up the illusion of my beginnings, as though he had robbed our common life of the last spark of its glamour. And so you cleared out at once." "Jumped," he corrected me incisively. "Jumped, mind," he repeated, and I wondered at the evident but obscure intention. Well, yes, perhaps I could not see then, but I had plenty of time and any amount of light in that boat. And I could think too. Nobody would know, of course, but this did not make it any easier for me. You've got to believe that too. I did not want all this talk. No. Yes. I won't lie. I wanted it. It is the very thing I wanted. There. Do you think you or anybody could have made me if I'm not afraid to tell, and I wasn't afraid to think either. I looked it in the face. I wasn't going to run away. At first, at night, if it hadn't been for those fellows, I might have— No, by heavens. I was not going to give them that satisfaction. They had done enough. They made up a story and believed it for all I know. But I knew the truth, and I would live it down, alone, with myself. I wasn't going to give in to such a beastly, unfair thing. What did it prove after all? I was confoundedly cut up, sick of life, to tell you the truth. But what would have been the good to shirk it in that way? That was not the way. I believe it would have ended. Nothing. He had been walking up and down, but with the last word, he turned short at me. "What do you believe?" he asked with violence. A pause ensued, and suddenly I felt myself overcome by a profound and hopeless fatigue, as though his voice had startled me out of a dream of wandering through empty spaces, whose immensity had harassed my soul and exhausted my body. "Would have ended nothing," he muttered over me obstinately after a little while. "No, the proper thing was to face it out, alone for myself, wait for another chance, find out." Chapter 12. All around everything was still as far as the ear could reach. The mist of his feelings shifted between us, as if disturbed by his struggles, and in the rifts of the immaterial veil he would appear to my staring eyes distinct of form and pregnant with vague appeal, like a symbolic figure in a picture. The chill air of the night seemed to lie on my limbs, as heavy as a slab of marble. "I see," I murmured, more to prove to myself that I could break my state of numbness than for any other reason. "The Avondale picked us up just before sunset," he remarked moodily. "Steamed right straight for us. We had only to sit and wait." After a long interval, he said, "They told their story." And again, there was that oppressive silence. Then only I knew what it was I had made up my mind to, he added. "You said nothing," I whispered. "What could I say?" he asked, in the same low tone. "Shock slight. Stopped the ship. Ascertained the damage. Took measures to get the boats out without creating a panic. As the first boat was lowered, ship went down in a squall. Sank like lead. What could be more clear?" He hung his head. "And more awful?" His lips quivered while he looked straight into my eyes. "I had jumped, hadn't I?" he asked, dismayed. "That's what I had to live down. The story didn't matter." He clasped his hands for an instant, glanced right and left into the gloom. "It was like cheating the dead," he stammered. "And there were no dead," I said. He went away from me at this. That is the only way I can describe it. In a moment I saw his back close to the balustrade. He stood there for some time, as if admiring the purity and the peace of the night. Some flowering shrub in the garden below spread its powerful scent through the damp air. He returned to me with hasty steps. "And that did not matter," he said, as stubbornly as you please. "Perhaps not," I admitted. I began to have a notion he was too much for me. After all, what did I know? Dead or not dead, I could not get clear, he said. I had to live, hadn't I? "Well, yes, if you take it in that way," I mumbled. "I was glad, of course," he threw out carelessly, with his mind fixed on something else. "The exposure," he pronounced slowly, and lifted his head. "Do you know what was my first thought when I heard? I was relieved. I was relieved to learn that those shouts— did I tell you I had heard shouts? No? Well, I did. Shouts for help, blown along with the drizzle. Imagination, I suppose. And yet I can hardly— How stupid. The others did not. I asked them afterwards. They all said no, no, and I was hearing them even then. I might have known, but I didn't think. I only listened. Very faint screams day after day. Then that little half-caste chap here came up and spoke to me. The Patna, French gunboat, towed successfully to Aden. Investigation, Marine Office, Sailor's Home, arrangements made for your board and lodging. I walked along with him, and I enjoyed the silence. So there had been no shouting, imagination. I had to believe him. I could hear nothing any more. I wonder how long I could have stood it. It was getting worse, too. I mean, louder. He fell into thought. And I had heard nothing? Well, so be it. But the lights. The lights did go. We did not see them. They were not there. If they had been, I would have swam back. I would have gone back and shouted alongside. I would have begged them to take me on board. I would have had my chance. You doubt me? How do you know how I felt? What right have you to doubt? I very nearly did it as it was. Do you understand? His voice fell. There was not a glimmer, he protested mournfully. Don't you understand that if there had been, you would not have seen me here? You see me, and you doubt. I shook my head negatively. This question of the lights being lost sight of when the boat could not have been more than a quarter of a mile from the ship was a matter for much discussion. Jim stuck to it that there was nothing to be seen after the first shower had cleared away, and the others had affirmed the same thing to the officers of the Avondale. Of course, people shook their heads and smiled. One old skipper who sat near me in court tickled my ear with his white beard to murmur, "Of course they would lie." As a matter of fact, nobody lied, not even the chief engineer with his story of the masthead light dropping like a match you throw down. Not consciously, at least. A man with his liver in such a state might very well have seen a floating spark in the corner of his eye when stealing a hurried glance over his shoulder. They had seen no light of any sort, though they were well within range, and they could only explain this in one way. The ship had gone down. It was obvious and comforting. The foreseen fact coming so swiftly had justified their haste. No wonder they did not cast about for any other explanation. Yet the true one was very simple, and as soon as Brearley suggested it, the court ceased to bother about the question. If you remember, the ship had been stopped and was lying with her head on the course, steered through the night, with her stern canted high and her bows brought low down in the water through the filling of the fore compartment. Being thus out of trim, when the squall struck her a little on the quarter, she swung head to wind as sharply as though she had been at anchor. By this change in her position, all her lights were in a very few moments shut off from the boat to leeward. It may very well be that, had they been seen, they would have had the effect of a mute appeal, that their glimmer, lost in the darkness of the cloud, would have had the mysterious power of the human glance that can awaken the feelings of remorse and pity. It would have said, "I am here, still here." And what more can the eye of the most forsaken of human beings say? But she turned her back on them as if in disdain of their fate. She had swung round, burdened, to glare stubbornly at the new danger of the open sea, which she so strangely survived, to end her days in a breaking-up yard, as if it had been her recorded fate to die obscurely under the blows of many hammers. What were the various ends their destiny provided for the pilgrims I am unable to say. But the immediate future brought, at about 9 o'clock next morning, a French gunboat homeward, bound from Reunion. The report of her commander was public property. He had swept a little out of his course to ascertain what was the matter with that steamer floating dangerously by the head upon a still and hazy sea. There was an ensign, Union down, flying at her main gaff. The serang had the sense to make a signal of distress at daylight. But the cooks were preparing the food in the cooking boxes forward as usual. The decks were packed as close as a sheep pen. There were people perched all along the rails, jammed on the bridge in a solid mass. Hundreds of eyes stared, and not a sound was heard when the gunboat ranged abreast, as if all that multitude of lips had been sealed by a spell. The Frenchman hailed, could get no intelligible reply, and after ascertaining through his binoculars that the crowd on deck did not look plague-stricken, decided to send a boat. 2 officers came on board, listened to the serang, tried to talk with the Arab, couldn't make head or tail of it, but of course the nature of the emergency was obvious enough. They were also very much struck by discovering a white man, dead and curled up peacefully on the bridge. Fort intrigue par ce cadavre, as I was informed a long time after by an elderly French lieutenant whom I came across one afternoon in Sydney, by the merest chance, in a sort of café, and who remembered the affair perfectly. Indeed, this affair, I may notice in passing, had an extraordinary power of defying the shortness of memories and the length of time. It seemed to live, with a sort of uncanny vitality, in the minds of men, on the tips of their tongues. I've had the questionable pleasure of meeting it often, years afterwards, thousands of miles away, emerging from the remotest possible talk, coming to the surface of the most distant allusions. Has it not turned up tonight between us? And I am the only seaman here. I am the only one to whom it is a memory. And yet it has made its way out. But if 2 men who, unknown to each other, knew of this affair, Met accidentally on any spot of this earth, the thing would pop up between them as sure as fate, before they parted. I had never seen that Frenchman before, and at the end of an hour we had done with each other for life. He did not seem particularly talkative either. He was a quiet, massive chap in a creased uniform, sitting drowsily over a tumbler half full of some dark liquid. His shoulder straps were a bit tarnished. His clean-shaved cheeks were large and sallow. He looked like a man who would be given to taking snuff. Don't you know? I won't say he did, but the habit would have fitted that kind of man. It all began by his handing me a number of home news, which I didn't want, across the marble table. I said merci. We exchanged a few apparently innocent remarks, and suddenly, before I knew how it had come about, we were in the midst of it, and he was telling me how much they had been intrigued by that corpse. It turned out he had been one of the boarding officers. In the establishment where we sat, one could get a variety of foreign drinks which were kept for the visiting naval officers, and he took a sip of the dark, medical-looking stuff, which probably was nothing more nasty than cassis à l'eau, and glancing with one eye into the tumbler, shook his head slightly. "Impossible de comprendre, vous concevez?" he said, with a curious mixture of unconcern and thoughtfulness. I could very easily conceive how impossible it had been for them to understand. Nobody in the gunboat knew enough English to get hold of the story as told by the serang. There was a good deal of noise, too, round the two officers. They crowded upon us. There was a circle round that dead man, autour de ces morts, he described. One had to attend to the most pressing. These people were beginning to agitate themselves. Parbleu! A mob like that, don't you see? He interjected with philosophic indulgence. As to the bulkhead, he had advised his commander that the safest thing was to leave it alone. It was so villainous to look at. They got two hawsers on board promptly, en toute hull, and took the Patna in tow, stern foremost at that, which, under the circumstances, was not so foolish, since the rudder was too much out of the water to be of any great use for steering, and this manoeuvre eased the strain on the bulkhead, whose state, he expounded with stolid glibness, demanded the greatest care, exigeait les plus grands ménagements. I could not help thinking that my new acquaintance must have had a voice in most of these arrangements. He looked a reliable officer, no longer very active, and he was seaman-like too in a way, though as he sat there, with his thick fingers clasped lightly on his stomach, he reminded you of one of those snuffy, quiet village priests into whose ears are poured the sins, the sufferings, the remorse of peasant generations, on whose faces the placid and simple expression is like a veil thrown over the mystery of pain and distress. He ought to have had a threadbare black soutane buttoned smoothly up to his ample chin, instead of a frock coat with shoulder straps and brass buttons. His broad bosom heaved regularly while he went on telling me that it had been the very devil of a job, as doubtless, sans doute, I could figure to myself in my quality of a seaman, en votre qualité de marin. At the end of the period he inclined his body slightly towards me, and pursing his shaved lips, allowed the air to escape with a gentle hiss. Luckily, he continued, the sea was level like this table, and there was no more wind than there is here. Done. The place struck me as indeed intolerably stuffy and very hot. My face burned as though I had been young enough to be embarrassed and blushing. They had directed their course, he pursued, to the nearest English port naturellement, where their responsibility ceased. Dieu merci. He blew out his flat cheeks a little. Because, mind you, notez bien, all the time of towing we had two quartermasters stationed with axes by the hawsers to cut us clear of our tow in case she— He fluttered downwards his heavy eyelids, making his meaning as plain as possible. What would you? One does what one can, on fait ci qu'on peut. And for a moment he managed to invest his ponderous immobility with an air of resignation. Two quartermasters, 30 hours, always there, 2, he repeated, lifting up his right hand a little and exhibiting 2 fingers. This was absolutely the first gesture I saw him make. It gave me the opportunity to note a starred scar on the back of his hand, effect of a gunshot clearly. And as if my sight had been made more acute by this discovery, I perceived also the seam of an old wound, beginning a little below the temple and going out of sight under the short grey hair at the side of his head, the graze of a spear or the cut of a sabre. He clasped his hands on his stomach again. I remained on board that my memory is going, s'en va. Ah, Patna, c'est bien car Patna, merci. It is droll how one forgets. I stayed on that ship 30 hours. You did, I exclaimed. Still gazing at his hands, he pursed his lips a little, but this time made no hissing sound. It was judged proper, he said, lifting his eyebrows dispassionately, that one of the officers should remain to keep an eye open, pour ouvrir l'œil. He sighed idly. And for communicating by signals with the towing ship, do you see? And so on. For the rest, it was my opinion too. We made our boats ready to drop over, and I also, on that ship, took measures. And Finn. One has done one's possible. It was a delicate position. 30 hours. They prepared me some food. As for the wine, go and whistle for it, not a drop. In some extraordinary way, without any marked change in his inert attitude and in the placid expression of his face, he managed to convey the idea of profound disgust. You know, when it comes to eating without my glass of wine, I am nowhere. I was afraid he would enlarge upon the grievance, for though he didn't stir a limb or twitch a feature, he made one aware how much he was irritated by the recollection, but he seemed to forget all about it. They delivered their charge to the port authorities, as he expressed it. He was struck by the calmness with which it had been received. One might have thought they had such a droll find, drôle de trouvaille, brought them every day. You are extraordinary. You others, he commented, with his back propped against the wall and looking himself as incapable of an emotional display as a sack of meal. There happened to be a man-of-war and an Indian marine steamer in the harbour at the time, and he did not conceal his admiration of the efficient manner in which the boats of these 2 ships cleared the Patna of her passengers. Indeed, his torpid demeanour concealed nothing. It had that mysterious, almost miraculous power of producing striking effects by means impossible of detection, which is the last word of the highest art. 25 minutes, watch in hand, 25, no more. He unclasped and clasped again his fingers without removing his hands from his stomach, and made it infinitely more effective than if he had thrown up his arms to heaven in amazement. All that lot, tout ce monde, on shore, with their little affairs, nobody left but a guard of seamen, marins de l'État, and that interesting corpse, cet interessant cadavre. 25 minutes. With downcast eyes and his head tilted slightly on one side, he seemed to roll knowingly on his tongue the savour of a smart bit of work. He persuaded one, without any further demonstration, that his approval was eminently worth having, and resuming his hardly interrupted immobility, he went on to inform me that being under orders to make the best of their way to Toulon, they left in 2 hours' time, so that, de sorte que, there are many things in this incident of my life, dans cet épisode de ma vie, which have remained obscure. Chapter 13. After these words, and without a change of attitude, he, so to speak, submitted himself passively to a state of silence. I kept him company, and suddenly, but not abruptly, as if the appointed time had arrived for his moderate and husky voice to come out of his immobility, he pronounced, "Mon Dieu, how the time passes!" Nothing could have been more commonplace than this remark, but its utterance coincided for me with a moment of vision. It's extraordinary how we go through life with eyes half shut, with dull ears, with dormant thoughts. Perhaps it's just as well, and it may be that it is this very dullness that makes life to the incalculable majority so supportable and so welcome. Nevertheless, there can be but few of us who had never known one of these rare moments of awakening when we see, hear, understand ever so much everything in a flash before we fall back again into our agreeable somnolence. I raised my eyes when he spoke, and I saw him as though I had never seen him before. I saw his chin sunk on his breast, the clumsy folds of his coat, his clasped hands, his motionless pose, so curiously suggestive of his having been simply left there. Time had passed indeed. It had overtaken him and gone ahead. It had left him hopelessly behind with a few poor gifts: the iron-grey hair, the heavy fatigue of the tanned face, 2 scars, a pair of tarnished shoulder straps. One of those steady, reliable men who are the raw material of great reputations, one of those uncounted lives that are buried without drums and trumpets under the foundations of monumental successes. I am now 3rd Lieutenant of the Victorieuse. She was the flagship of the French Pacific Squadron at the time, he said, detaching his shoulders from the wall a couple of inches to introduce himself. I bowed slightly on my side of the table and told him I commanded a merchant vessel at present anchored in Rushcutter's Bay. He had remarked her, a pretty little craft. He was very civil about it, in his impassive way. I even fancy he went the length of tilting his head in compliment as he repeated, breathing visibly the while, "Ah, yes, a little craft painted black, very pretty, très coquet." After a time, he twisted his body slowly to face the glass door on our right. "A dull town, triste ville," he observed, staring into the street. It was a brilliant day. A southerly buster was raging, and we could see the passers-by, men and women, buffeted by the wind on the sidewalks, the sunlit fronts of the houses across the road, blurred by the tall whirls of dust. "I descended on shore," he said, "to stretch my legs a little, but—" He didn't finish, and sank into the depths of his repose. "Pray, tell me," he began, coming up ponderously, "what was there at the bottom of this affair, precisely, au juste? It is curious. That dead man, for instance, and so on." "There were living men too," I said. "Much more curious." No doubt," he agreed half-audibly, then, as if after mature consideration, murmured, "Evidently." I made no difficulty in communicating to him what had interested me most in this affair. It seemed as though he had a right to know. Hadn't he spent 30 hours on board the Patna? Had he not taken the succession, so to speak? Had he not done his possible? He listened to me, looking more priest-like than ever, and with what, probably on account of his downcast eyes, had the appearance of devout concentration. Once or twice he elevated his eyebrows, but without raising his eyelids, as one would say, "The devil." Once he calmly exclaimed, "Ah, bah," under his breath, and when I had finished, he pursed his lips in a deliberate way and emitted a sort of sorrowful whistle. In anyone else, it might have been an evidence of boredom, a sign of indifference, but he, in his occult way, managed to make his immobility appear profoundly responsive, and as full of valuable thoughts as an egg is of meat. What he said at last was nothing more than a "very interesting," pronounced politely, and not much above a whisper. Before I got over my disappointment, he added, but as if speaking to himself, "That's it. That is it." His chin seemed to sink lower on his breast, his body to weigh heavier on his seat. I was about to ask him what he meant, when a sort of preparatory tremor passed over his whole person, as a faint ripple may be seen upon stagnant water even before the wind is felt. "And so that poor young man ran away along with the others," he said, with grave tranquillity. I don't know what made me smile. It is the only genuine smile of mine I can remember in connection with Jim's affair. But somehow, this simple statement of the matter sounded funny in French. C'est enfui avec les autres, had said the lieutenant. And suddenly I began to admire the discrimination of the man. He had made out the point at once. He did get hold of the only thing I cared about. I felt as though I were taking professional opinion on the case. His imperturbable and mature calmness was that of an expert in possession of the facts, and to whom one's perplexities are mere child's play. "Ah, the young," he said indulgently, "and after all one does not die of it." "Die of what?" I asked swiftly. "Of being afraid." He elucidated his meaning and sipped his drink. I perceived that the 3 last fingers of his wounded hand were stiff and could not move independently of each other, so that he took up his tumbler with an ungainly clutch. One is always afraid. One may talk, but— He put down the glass awkwardly. The fear. Look you, it is always there. He touched his breast near a brass button, on the very spot where Jim had given a thump to his own, when protesting that there was nothing the matter with his heart. I suppose I made some sign of dissent, because he insisted, "Yes, yes. One talks. This is all very fine. But at the end of the reckoning, one is no cleverer than the next man, and no more brave. Brave. This is always to be seen. I have rolled my hump, roule ma bosse," he said, using the slang expression with imperturbable seriousness. "In all parts of the world I have known brave men, famous ones. Allez." He drank carelessly. "Brave, you conceive, in the service. One has got to be. The trade demands it. Le métier veut ça. Is it not so?" He appealed to me reasonably. "Eh bien, each of them, I say each of them, if he were an honest man, bien entendu, would confess that there is a point. There is a point, for the best of us. There is somewhere a point when you let go everything. Vous lâchez tout. And you have got to live with that truth. Do you see? Given a certain combination of circumstances, fear is sure to come. Abominable funk, untrack épouvantable. And even for those who do not believe this truth, there is fear all the same. The fear of themselves. Absolutely so. Trust me. Yes, yes. At my age one knows what one is talking about. Que diable. He had delivered himself of all this as immovably as though he had been the mouthpiece of abstract wisdom. But at this point he heightened the effect of detachment by beginning to twirl his thumbs slowly. "It's evident, parbleu," he continued, "for make up your mind as much as you like, even a simple headache or a fit of indigestion, un derangement de stomach, is enough to— Take me, for instance. I have made my proofs. Eh bien, I who am speaking to you once—" He drained his glass and returned to his twirling. "No, one does not die of it," he pronounced finally, and when I found he did not mean to proceed with the personal anecdote, I was extremely disappointed. The more so as it was not the sort of story, you know, one could very well press him for. I sat silent, and he too, as if nothing could please him better. Even his thumbs were still now. Suddenly his lips began to move. "That is so," he resumed placidly. "Man is born a coward, l'homme est Napoléon. It is a difficulty, parbleu. It would be too easy otherwise, but habit, necessity. Do you see? The eye of others, voila. One puts up with it. And then the example of others who are no better than yourself, and yet make good countenance." His voice ceased. That young man, you will observe, had none of these inducements, at least at the moment, I remarked. He raised his eyebrows forgivingly. I don't say. The young man in question might have had the best dispositions. The best dispositions, he repeated, wheezing a little. "I am glad to see you taking a lenient view," I said. His own feeling in the matter was, hopeful and— The shuffle of his feet under the table interrupted me. He drew up his heavy eyelids. Drew up, I say, no other expression can describe the steady deliberation of the act, and at last was disclosed completely to me. I was confronted by two narrow grey circlets, like two tiny steel rings around the profound blackness of the pupils. The sharp glance coming from that massive body gave a notion of extreme efficiency, like a razor edge on a battle-axe. "Pardon," he said punctiliously. His right hand went up, and he swayed forward. "Allow me. I contended that one may get on knowing very well that one's courage does not come of itself. Ne vient pas tout seul. There's nothing much in that to get upset about. One truth the more ought not to make life impossible. But the honor, monsieur, the honor, that is real, that is. And what life may be worth when—" He got on his feet with a ponderous impetuosity, as a startled ox might scramble up from the grass. "When the honor is gone, aka, par exemple, I can offer no opinion. I can offer no opinion because, monsieur, I know nothing of it." I had risen too, and trying to throw infinite politeness into our attitudes, we faced each other mutely, like two china dogs on a mantelpiece. Hang the fellow, he had pricked the bubble. The blight of futility that lies in wait for men's speeches had fallen upon our conversation and made it a thing of empty sounds. "Very well," I said, with a disconcerted smile. "But couldn't it reduce itself to not being found out?" He made as if to retort readily, but when he spoke he had changed his mind. "This, monsieur, is too fine for me, much above me. I don't think about it." He bowed heavily over his cap, which he held before him by the peak, between the thumb and the forefinger of his wounded hand. I bowed too. We bowed together. We scraped our feet at each other with much ceremony, while a dirty specimen of a waiter looked on critically, as though he had paid for the performance. "Serviteur," said the Frenchman. Another scrape. Monsieur. The glass door swung behind his burly back. I saw the southerly buster get hold of him and drive him down wind with his hand to his head, his shoulders braced, and the tails of his coat blown hard against his legs. I sat down again alone and discouraged about Jim's case. If you wonder that after more than 3 years it had preserved its actuality, you must know that I had seen him only very lately. I had come straight from Samarang, where I had loaded a cargo for Sydney, an utterly uninteresting bit of business, what Charlie here would call one of my rational transactions, and in Samarang I had seen something of Jim. He was then working for De Jong, on my recommendation. Water clerk. My representative afloat, as De Jong called him. You can't imagine a mode of life more barren of consolation, less capable of being invested with a spark of glamour, unless it be the business of an insurance canvasser. Little Bob Stanton, Charlie here knew him well, had gone through that experience. The same who got drowned afterwards trying to save a lady's maid in the Sephora disaster, a case of collision on a hazy morning off the Spanish coast, you may remember. All the passengers had been packed tidily into the boats and shoved clear of the ship, when Bob sheered alongside again and scrambled back on deck to fetch that girl. How she had been left behind, I can't make out. Anyhow, she had gone completely crazy, wouldn't leave the ship, held to the rail like grim death. The wrestling match could be seen plainly from the boats. But poor Bob was the shortest chief mate in the merchant service, and the woman stood 5'10" in her shoes, and was as strong as a horse, I've been told. So it went on, pull devil, pull baker, the wretched girl screaming all the time, and Bob letting out a yell now and then to warn his boat to keep well clear of the ship. One of the hands told me, hiding a smile at the recollection, "It was for all the world, sir, like a naughty youngster fighting with his mother." The same old chap said that, at the last, we could see that Mr. Stanton had given up hauling at the gal, and just stood by looking at her, watchful-like. We thought afterwards he must have been reckoning that Maybe the rush of water would tear her away from the rail by and by and give him a show to save her. We daren't come alongside for our life, and after a bit, the old ship went down all on a sudden with a lurch to starboard. Plop. The suck-in was something awful. We never saw anything alive or dead come up. Poor Bob's spell of shore life had been one of the complications of a love affair, I believe. He fondly hoped he had done with the sea forever, and made sure he had got hold of all the bliss on earth. But it came to canvassing in the end. Some cousin of his in Liverpool put up to it. He used to tell us his experiences in that line. He made us laugh till we cried, and not altogether displeased at the effect, undersized and bearded to the waist like a gnome, he would tiptoe amongst us and say, "It's all very well for you beggars to laugh, but my immortal soul was shriveled down to the size of a parched pea after a week of that work." I don't know how Jim's soul accommodated itself to the new conditions of his life. I was kept too busy in getting him something to do that would keep body and soul together, but I'm pretty certain his adventurous fancy was suffering all the pangs of starvation. It had certainly nothing to feed upon in this new calling. It was distressing to see him at it, though he tackled it with a stubborn serenity for which I must give him full credit. I kept my eye on his shabby plodding with a sort of notion that it was a punishment for the heroics of his fancy, an expiation for his craving after more glamour than he could carry. He had loved too well to imagine himself a glorious racehorse, and now he was condemned to toil without honour like a costermonger's donkey. He did it very well. He shut himself in, put his head down, said never a word. Very well indeed, except for certain fantastic and violent outbreaks on the deplorable occasions when the irrepressible Patna case cropped up. Unfortunately, that scandal of the Eastern seas would not die out. And this is the reason why I could never feel I had done with Jim for good. I sat thinking of him after the French lieutenant had left, not, however, in connection with de Jong's cool and gloomy back-shop, where we had hurriedly shaken hands not very long ago, but as I had seen him years before, in the last flickers of the candle, alone with me in the long gallery of the Malabar House, with the chill and the darkness of the night at his back. The respectable sword of his country's law was suspended over his head. Tomorrow, or was it today? Midnight had slipped by long before we parted. The marble-faced police magistrate, after distributing fines and terms of imprisonment in the assault and battery case, would take up the awful weapon and smite his bowed neck. Our communion in the night was uncommonly like a last vigil with a condemned man. He was guilty too. He was guilty, as I had told myself repeatedly, guilty and done for. Nevertheless, I wished to spare him the mere detail of a formal execution. I don't pretend to explain the reasons of my desire. I don't think I could. But if you haven't got a sort of notion by this time, then I must have been very obscure in my narrative, or you too sleepy to seize upon the sense of my words. I don't defend my morality. There was no morality in the impulse which induced me to lay before him Brearley's plan of evasion, I may call it, in all its primitive simplicity. There were the rupees, absolutely ready in my pocket, and very much at his service. Oh, a loan, of course. And if an introduction to a man in Rangoon who could put some work in his way, why, with the greatest pleasure. I had pen, ink, and paper in my room on the first floor, and even while I was speaking, I was impatient to begin the letter. Day, month, year, 2:30 a.m. For the sake of our old friendship, I ask you to put some work in the way of Mr. James so-and-so, in whom, and see. I was even ready to write in that strain about him. If he had not enlisted my sympathies, he had done better for himself. He had gone to the very fount and origin of that sentiment. He had reached the secret sensibility of my egoism. I am concealing nothing from you, because were I to do so, my action would appear more unintelligible than any man's action has the right to be, and, in the second place, tomorrow you will forget my sincerity along with the other lessons of the past. In this transaction, to speak grossly and precisely, I was the irreproachable man, but the subtle intentions of my immorality were defeated by the moral simplicity of the criminal. No doubt he was selfish too, but his selfishness had a higher origin, a more lofty aim. I discovered that, say what I would, he was eager to go through the ceremony of execution, and I didn't say much, for I felt that in argument his youth would tell against me heavily. He believed where I had already ceased to doubt. There was something fine in the wildness of his unexpressed, hardly formulated hope. "Clear out. Couldn't think of it," he said with a shake of the head. "I make you an offer for which I neither demand nor expect any sort of gratitude," I said. "You shall repay the money when convenient, and—" "Awfully good of you," he muttered, without looking up. I watched him narrowly. The future must have appeared horribly uncertain to him, but he did not falter, as though indeed there had been nothing wrong with his heart. I felt angry, not for the first time that night. "The whole wretched business," I said, "is bitter enough, I should think, for a man of your kind." It is," he whispered twice, with his eyes fixed on the floor. It was heartrending. He towered above the light, and I could see the down on his cheek, the color mantling warm under the smooth skin of his face. Believe me or not, I say it was outrageously heartrending. It provoked me to brutality. "Yes," I said, "and allow me to confess that I'm totally unable to imagine what advantage you can expect from this licking of the dregs." "Advantage," he murmured out of his stillness. "I am dashed if I do," I said, enraged. "I've been trying to tell you all there is in it," he went on slowly, as if meditating something unanswerable. "But after all, it is my trouble." I opened my mouth to retort, and discovered suddenly that I'd lost all confidence in myself, and it was as if he too had given me up, for he mumbled like a man thinking half aloud. "Went away, went into hospitals, not one of them would face it. They—" He moved his hand slightly to imply disdain. "But I've got to get over this thing, and I mustn't shirk any of it, or—" "I won't shirk any of it." He was silent. He gazed as though he had been haunted. His unconscious face reflected the passing expressions of scorn, of despair, of resolution, reflected them in turn, as a magic mirror would reflect the gliding passage of unearthly shapes. He lived surrounded by deceitful ghosts, by austere shades. "Oh, nonsense, my dear fellow," I began. He had a movement of impatience. "You don't seem to understand," he said incisively, then looking at me without a wink. "I may have jumped, but I don't run away." "I meant no offense," I said, and added stupidly, "Better men than you have found it expedient to run at times." He colored all over, while in my confusion I half choked myself with my own tongue. "Perhaps so," he said at last. "I am not good enough. I can't afford it. I'm bound to fight this thing down. I'm fighting it now." I got out of my chair and felt stiff all over. The silence was embarrassing, and to put an end to it, I imagined nothing better but to remark, "I had no idea it was so late," in an airy tone. "I dare say you have had enough of this," he said brusquely. "And to tell you the truth," he began to look round for his hat, "so have I." Well, he had refused this unique offer. He had struck aside my helping hand. He was ready to go now, and beyond the balustrade, the night seemed to wait for him very still, as though he had been marked down for its prey. I heard his voice. "Ah, here it is." He had found his hat. For a few seconds we hung in the wind. "What will you do after—" I asked very low. "Go to the dogs as likely as not," he answered in a gruff mutter. I had recovered my wits in a measure, and judged best to take it lightly. "Pray remember," I said, "that I should like very much to see you again before you go." "I don't know what's to prevent you. The damned thing won't make me invisible," he said with intense bitterness. "No such luck." And then, at the moment of taking leave, he treated me to a ghastly muddle of dubious stammers and movements, to an awful display of hesitations. God forgive him, me. He had taken it into his fanciful head that I was likely to make some difficulty as to shaking hands. It was too awful for words. I believe I shouted suddenly at him as you would bellow to a man you saw about to walk over a cliff. I remember our voices being raised, the appearance of a miserable grin on his face, a crushing clutch on my hand, a nervous laugh. The candle spluttered out, and the thing was over at last, with a groan that floated up to me in the dark. He got himself away somehow. The night swallowed his form. He was a horrible bungler. Horrible. I heard the quick crunch of the gravel under his boots. He was running. Absolutely running, with nowhere to go to. And he was not yet 24. Chapter 14. I slept little, hurried over my breakfast, and after a slight hesitation gave up my early morning visit to my ship. It was really very wrong of me because, though my chief mate was an excellent man all round, he was the victim of such black imaginings that if he did not get a letter from his wife at the expected time, he would go quite distracted with rage and jealousy, lose all grip on the work, quarrel with all hands, and either weep in his cabin or develop such a ferocity of temper as all but drove the crew to the verge of mutiny. The thing had always seemed inexplicable to me. They had been married 13 years. I had a glimpse of her once, and honestly, I couldn't conceive a man abandoned enough to plunge into sin for the sake of such an unattractive person. I don't know whether I've not done wrong by refraining from putting that view before poor Selwyn. The man made a little hell on earth for himself, and I also suffered indirectly, but some sort of, no doubt, false delicacy prevented me. The marital relations of seamen would make an interesting subject, and I could tell you instances. However, this is not the place nor the time, and we are concerned with Jim, who was unmarried. If his imaginative conscience or his pride, if all the extravagant ghosts and austere shades that were the disastrous familiars of his youth would not let him run away from the block, I, who of course can't be suspected of such familiars, was irresistibly impelled to go and see his head roll off. I wended my way towards the court. I didn't hope to be very much impressed or edified or interested or even frightened, though, as long as there is any life before one, a jolly good fright now and then is a salutary discipline. But neither did I expect to be so awfully depressed. The bitterness of his punishment was in its chill and mean atmosphere. The real significance of crime is in its being a breach of faith with the community of mankind, and from that point of view he was no mean traitor, but his execution was a hole-and-corner affair. There was no high scaffolding, no scarlet cloth. Did they have scarlet cloth on Tower Hill? They should have had. No awe-stricken multitude to be horrified at his guilt and be moved to tears at his fate. No air of sombre retribution. There was, as I walked along, the clear sunshine, a brilliance too passionate to be consoling, the streets full of jumbled bits of colour like a damaged kaleidoscope. Yellow, green, blue, dazzling white, the brown nudity of an undraped shoulder, a bullock cart with a red canopy, a company of native infantry in a drab body with dark heads marching in dusty laced boots, a native policeman in a sombre uniform of scanty cut and belted in patent leather, who looked up at me with orientally pitiful eyes as though his migrating spirit were suffering exceedingly from that unforeseen, what do you call 'em, avatar incarnation. Under the shade of a lonely tree in the courtyard, the villagers connected with the assault case sat in a picturesque group, looking like a chromolithograph of a camp in a book of Eastern travel. One missed the obligatory thread of smoke in the foreground and the pack animals grazing. A blank yellow wall rose behind, overtopping the tree, reflecting the glare. The courtroom was sombre, seemed more vast. High up in the dim space, the punkahs were swaying short to and fro, to and fro. Here and there, a draped figure, dwarfed by the bare walls, remained without stirring amongst the rows of empty benches, as if absorbed in pious meditation. The plaintiff, who had been beaten, an obese chocolate-coloured man with shaved head, one fat breast bare, and a bright yellow caste mark above the bridge of his nose, sat in pompous immobility. Only his eyes glittered, rolling in the gloom, and the nostrils dilated and collapsed violently as he breathed. Brearley dropped into his seat, looking done up, as though he had spent the night in sprinting on a cinder track. The pious sailing ship skipper appeared excited and made uneasy movements, as if restraining with difficulty an impulse to stand up and exhort us earnestly to prayer and repentance. The head of the magistrate, delicately pale under the neatly arranged hair, resembled the head of a hopeless invalid after he had been washed and brushed and propped up in bed. He moved aside the vase of flowers, a bunch of purple with a few pink blossoms on long stalks, and seizing in both hands a long sheet of bluish paper, ran his eye over it, propped his forearms on the edge of the desk, and began to read aloud in an even, distinct, and careless voice. By Jove! For all my foolishness about scaffolds and heads rolling off, I assure you it was infinitely worse than a beheading. A heavy sense of finality brooded over all this, unrelieved by the hope of rest and safety following the fall of the axe. These proceedings had all the cold vengefulness of a death sentence and the cruelty of a sentence of exile. This is how I looked at it that morning, and even now I seem to see an undeniable vestige of truth in that exaggerated view of a common occurrence. You may imagine how strongly I felt this at the time. Perhaps it is for that reason that I could not bring myself to admit the finality. The thing was always with me. I was always eager to take opinion on it, as though it had not been practically settled. Individual opinion, international opinion, by Jove, that Frenchman's, for instance. His own country's pronouncement was uttered in the passionless and definite phraseology a machine would use if machines could speak. The head of the magistrate was half hidden by the paper. His brow was like alabaster. There were several questions before the court. The first as to whether the ship was in every respect fit and seaworthy for the voyage. The court found she was not. The next point I remember was whether up to the time of the accident the ship had been navigated with proper and seaman-like care. They said yes to that, goodness knows why, and then they declared that there was no evidence to show the exact cause of the accident. A floating derelict, probably. I myself remember that a Norwegian bark, bound out with a cargo of pitch pine, had been given up as missing about that time, and it was just the sort of craft that would capsize in a squall and float bottom up for months, a kind of maritime ghoul on the prowl to kill ships in the dark. Such wandering corpses are common enough in the North Atlantic, which is haunted by all the terrors of the sea, fogs, icebergs, dead ships bent upon mischief, and long sinister gales that fasten upon one like a vampire, till all the strength and the spirit and even hope are gone, and one feels like the empty shell of a man. But there, in those seas, the incident was rare enough to resemble a special arrangement of a malevolent providence, which, unless it had for its object the killing of a donkey man and the bringing of worse than death upon Jim, appeared an utterly aimless piece of devilry. This view occurring to me took off my attention. For a time I was aware of the magistrate's voice as a sound merely, but in a moment it shaped itself into distinct words. In utter disregard of their plain duty, it said. The next sentence escaped me somehow. And then, abandoning in the moment of danger the lives and property confided to their charge, went on the voice evenly, and stopped. A pair of eyes under the white forehead shot darkly a glance above the edge of the paper. I looked for Jim hurriedly, as though I had expected him to disappear. He was very still, but he was there. He sat pink and fair and extremely attentive. "Therefore," began the voice emphatically. He stared with parted lips, hanging upon the words of the man behind the desk. These came out into the stillness, wafted on the wind made by the punkas, and I, watching for their effect upon him, caught only the fragments of official language. The court, Gustav so-and-so, master, native of Germany, James so-and-so, mate, certificates cancelled. A silence fell. The magistrate had dropped the paper, and leaning sideways on the arm of his chair, began to talk with Brierly easily. People started to move out. Others were pushing in, and I also made for the door. Outside, I stood still, and when Jim passed me on his way to the gate, I caught at his arm and detained him. The look he gave discomposed me, as though I had been responsible for his state. He looked at me as if I had been the embodied evil of life. "It's all over," I stammered. "Yes," he said thickly, "and now let no man." He jerked his arm out of my grasp. I watched his back as he went away. It was a long street, and he remained in sight for some time. He walked rather slow, and straddling his legs a little, as if he had found it difficult to keep a straight line. Just before I lost him, I fancied he staggered a bit. "Man overboard," said a deep voice behind me. Turning round, I saw a fellow I knew slightly, a West Australian. Chester was his name. He, too, had been looking after Jim. He was a man with an immense girth of chest, a rugged, clean-shaved face of mahogany colour, and two blunt tufts of iron-grey, thick, wiry hairs on his upper lip. He had been pearler, wrecker, trader, whaler too, I believe. In his own words, anything and everything a man may be at sea, but a pirate. The Pacific, north and south, was his proper hunting ground, but he had wandered so far afield, looking for a cheap steamer to buy. Lately he had discovered, so he said, a guano island somewhere, but its approaches were dangerous, and the anchorage, such as it was, could not be considered safe, to say the least of it. "As good as a gold mine," he would exclaim. "Right bang in the middle of the Walpole Reefs, and if it's true enough that you can get no holding ground anywhere in less than 40 fathom, then what of that? There are the hurricanes too. But it's a first-rate thing. As good as a gold mine, better. Yet there's not a fool of them that will see it. I can't get a skipper or a ship owner to go near the place. So I made up my mind to cart the blessed stuff myself." This was what he required a steamer for, and I knew he was just then negotiating enthusiastically with a Parsee firm for an old brig-rigged sea anachronism of 90 horsepower. We had met and spoken together several times. He looked knowingly after Jim. "Takes it to heart?" he asked scornfully. "Very much," I said. "Then he's no good," he opined. "What's all the to-do about? A bit of ass's skin. That never yet made a man. You must see things exactly as they are. If you don't, you may just as well give in at once. You will never do anything in this world. Look at me. I made it a practice never to take anything to heart." "Yes," I said. "You see things as they are." "I wish I could see my partner coming along." "That's what I wish to see," he said. "Know my partner? Old Robinson? Yes, the Robinson. Don't you know? The notorious Robinson, the man who smuggled more opium and bagged more seals in his time than any loose Johnny now alive. They say he used to board the sealing schooners up Alaska way when the fog was so thick that the Lord God, he alone, could tell one man from another. Holy Terror Robinson. That's the man. He is with me in that guano thing, the best chance he ever came across in his life." He put his lips to my ear. "Cannibal? Well, they used to give him the name years and years ago. You remember the story? A shipwreck on the west side of Stewart Island. That's right. 7 of them got ashore, and it seems they did not get on very well together. Some men are too cantankerous for anything, don't know how to make the best of a bad job, don't see things as they are, my boy. And then what's the consequence? Obvious. Trouble, trouble, as likely as not a knock on the head, and serve 'em right too. That sort is the most useful when it's dead. The story goes that a boat of Her Majesty's ship, Wolverine, found him kneeling on the kelp, naked as the day he was born, and chanting some psalm tune or other. Light snow was falling at the time. He waited till the boat was an oar's length from the shore, and then up and away. They chased him for an hour up and down the boulders, till a Marahi flung a stone that took him behind the ear providentially and knocked him senseless. Alone? Of course. But that's like that tale of sealing schooners. The Lord God knows the right and the wrong of that story. The cutter did not investigate much. They wrapped him in a boat cloak and took him off as quick as they could, with a dark night coming on, the weather threatening, and the ship firing recall guns every 5 minutes. 3 weeks afterwards he was as well as ever. He didn't allow any fuss that was made on shore to upset him. He just shut his lips tight and let people screech. It was bad enough to have lost his ship, and all he was worth besides, without paying attention to the hard names they called him. That's the man for me. He lifted his arm for a signal to someone down the street. He's got a little money, so I had to let him into my thing. Had to. It would have been sinful to throw away such a find, and I was cleaned out myself. It cut me to the quick, but I could see the matter just as it was, and if I must share, thinks I, with any man, then give me Robinson. I left him at breakfast in the hotel to come to court because I've an idea. Ah, good morning, Captain Robinson. Friend of mine, Captain Robinson. An emaciated patriarch in a suit of white drill, a solar topi with a green-lined rim on a head, trembling with age, joined us after crossing the street in a trotting shuffle and stood propped with both hands on the handle of an umbrella. A white beard with amber streaks hung lumpily down to his waist. He blinked his creased eyelids at me in a bewildered way. "How do you do? How do you do?" he piped amiably and tottered. "A little deaf," said Chester aside. "Did you drag him over 6,000 miles to get a cheap steamer?" I asked. "I would have taken him twice round the world as soon as look at him," said Chester with immense energy. "The steamer will be the making of us, my lad. Is it my fault that every skipper and ship owner in the whole of blessed Australasia turns out a blamed fool? Once I talked for 3 hours to a man in Auckland. 'Send a ship,' I said. 'Send a ship. I'll give you half of the first cargo for yourself, free gratis for nothing, just to make a good start.' Says he, 'I wouldn't do it if there was no other place on earth to send a ship to.' Perfect ass, of course. Rocks, currents, no anchorage, sheer cliff to lay to, no insurance company would take the risk, didn't see how he could get loaded under 3 years. Ass. I nearly went on my knees to him. But look at the thing as it is, says I. Damn rocks and hurricanes. Look at it as it is. There's guano there. Queensland sugar planters would fight for on the quay, I tell you. What can you do with a fool? That's one of your little jokes, Chester, he says. Joke. I could have wept. Ask Captain Robinson here. And there was another ship-owning fellow, a fat chap in a white waistcoat in Wellington, who seemed to think I was up to some swindle or other. I don't know what sort of fool you're looking for, he says, but I am busy just now. Good morning. I longed to take him in my 2 hands and smash him through the window of his own office. But I didn't. I was as mild as a curate. Think of it, says I. Do think it over. I'll call tomorrow. He grunted something about being out all day. On the stairs I felt ready to beat my head against the wall from vexation. Captain Robinson here can tell you. It was awful to think of all that lovely stuff lying waste under the sun, stuff that would send the sugar cane shooting sky high. The making of Queensland. The making of Queensland. And in Brisbane, where I went to have a last try, they gave me the name of a lunatic. Idiots! The only sensible man I came across was the cabman who drove me about. A broken-down swell he was, I fancy. Hey, Captain Robinson, you remember I told you about my cabbie in Brisbane, don't you? The chap had a wonderful eye for things. He saw it all in a jiffy. It was a real pleasure to talk with him. One evening, after a devil of a day amongst ship owners, I felt so bad that, says I must get drunk. Come along, I must get drunk or I'll go mad. I am your man, he says. Go ahead. I don't know what I would have done without him. Hey, Captain Robinson. He poked the ribs of his partner. Hey, 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 laughed the ancient, looked aimlessly down the street, then peered at me doubtfully with sad, dim pupils. Hey, hey, hey! He leaned heavier on the umbrella and dropped his gaze on the ground. I needn't tell you I had tried to get away several times, but Chester had foiled every attempt by simply catching hold of my coat. 1 minute. I've a notion. What's your infernal notion? I exploded at last. If you think I'm going in with you. No, no, my boy. Too late, if you want it ever so much. We've got a steamer. You've got the ghost of a steamer, I said. Good enough for a start. There's no superior nonsense about us. Is there, Captain Robinson? No, 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 croaked the old man without lifting his eyes, and the senile tremble of his head became almost fierce with determination. I understand you know that young chap, said Chester, with a nod at the street from which Jim had disappeared long ago. He's been having grub with you in the Malabar last night. So I was told. I said that was true, and after remarking that he too liked to live well and in style, only that for the present he had to be saving of every penny. None too many for the business. Isn't that so, Captain Robinson? He squared his shoulders and stroked his dumpy moustache, while the notorious Robinson, coughing at his side, clung more than ever to the handle of the umbrella and seemed ready to subside passively into a heap of old bones. You see, the old chap has all the money, whispered Chester confidentially. I've been cleaned out, trying to engineer the dratted thing. But wait a bit. The good time is coming. He seemed suddenly astonished at the signs of impatience I gave. Oh, crikey, he cried. I am telling you of the biggest thing that ever was, and you— I have an appointment, I pleaded mildly. What of that? He asked with genuine surprise. Let it wait. That's exactly what I am doing now, I remarked. Hadn't you better tell me what it is you want? Buy 20 hotels like that, he growled to himself, and every joker boarding in them too, 20 times over. He lifted his head smartly. I want that young chap. I don't understand, I said. He's no good, is he? Said Chester crisply. I know nothing about it, I protested. Why, you told me yourself he was taking it to heart, argued Chester. Well, in my opinion, a chap who— anyhow, he can't be much good. But then, you see, I'm on the lookout for somebody, and I've just got a thing that will suit him. I'll give him a job on my island. He nodded significantly. I'm going to dump 40 coolies there if I've to steal 'em. Somebody must work the stuff. Oh, I mean to act square. Wooden shed, corrugated iron roof. I know a man in Hobart who will take my bill at 6 months for the materials. I do. Honour bright. Then there's the water supply. I'll have to fly round and get somebody to trust me for half a dozen second-hand iron tanks. Catch rainwater, hey? Let him take charge. Make him supreme boss over the coolies. Good idea, isn't it? What do you say? There are whole years when not a drop of rain falls on Walpole, I said, too amazed to laugh. He bit his lip and seemed bothered. Oh, well, I will fix up something for them or land a supply. Hang it all, that's not the question. I said nothing. I had a rapid vision of Jim perched on a shadowless rock, up to his knees in guano, with the screams of seabirds in his ears, the incandescent ball of the sun above his head, the empty sky and the empty ocean all a quiver, simmering together in the heat as far as the eye could reach. "I wouldn't advise my worst enemy," I began. "What's the matter with you?" cried Chester. "I mean to give him a good screw. That is, as soon as the thing is set going, of course. It's as easy as falling off a log. Simply nothing to do. 2 6-shooters in his belt. Surely he wouldn't be afraid of anything 40 coolies could do, with 2 6-shooters and he the only armed man too. It's much better than it looks. I want you to help me to talk him over." "No!" I shouted. Old Robinson lifted his bleared eyes dismally for a moment. Chester looked at me with infinite contempt. "So you wouldn't advise him?" he uttered slowly. "Certainly not," I answered, as indignant as though he had requested me to help murder somebody. "Moreover, I'm sure he wouldn't. He is badly cut up, but he isn't mad as far as I know." "He is no earthly good for anything," Chester mused aloud. "He would just have done for me. If you only could see a thing as it is, you would see it's the very thing for him. And besides, why, it's the most splendid, sure chance." He got angry suddenly. "I must have a man. There." He stamped his foot and smiled unpleasantly. "Anyhow, I could guarantee the island wouldn't sink under him, and I believe he's a bit particular on that point." "Good morning," I said curtly. He looked at me as though I had been an incomprehensible fool. "Must be moving, Captain Robinson," he yelled suddenly into the old man's ear. "These Parsee Johnnies are waiting for us to clinch the bargain." He took his partner under the arm with a firm grip, swung him round, and unexpectedly leered at me over his shoulder. "I was trying to do him a kindness," he asserted, with an air and tone that made my blood boil. "Thank you for nothing, in his name," I rejoined. "Oh, you are devilish smart," he sneered, "but you are like the rest of them. Too much in the clouds. See what you will do with him." "I don't know that I want to do anything with him." "Don't you?" he spluttered. His grey moustache bristled with anger, and by his side the notorious Robinson, propped on the umbrella, stood with his back to me, as patient and still as a worn-out cab-horse. "I haven't found a guano island," I said. "It's my belief you wouldn't know one if you were led right up to it by the hand," he riposted quickly. "And in this world, you've got to see a thing first, before you can make use of it. Got to see it through and through at that, neither more nor less." "And get others to see it too," I insinuated, with a glance at the bowed back by his side. Chester snorted at me. "His eyes are right enough, don't you worry. He ain't a puppy." "Oh dear, no," I said. "Come along, Captain Robinson," he shouted, with a sort of bullying deference under the rim of the old man's hat. The Holy Terror gave a submissive little jump. The ghost of a steamer was waiting for them, fortune on that fair isle. They made a curious pair of Argonauts. Chester strode on leisurely, well set up, portly, and of conquering mien. The other, long, wasted, drooping, and hooked to his arm, shuffled his withered shanks with desperate haste. Chapter 15. I did not start in search of Jim at once, only because I had really an appointment which I could not neglect. Then, as ill luck would have it, in my agent's office I was fastened upon by a fellow fresh from Madagascar with a little scheme for a wonderful piece of business. It had something to do with cattle and cartridges and a Prince Ravonalo something. But the pivot of the whole affair was the stupidity of some admiral, Admiral Pierre, I think. Everything turned on that, and the chap couldn't find words strong enough to express his confidence. He had globular eyes starting out of his head with a fishy glitter, bumps on his forehead, and wore his long hair brushed back without a parting. He had a favourite phrase which he kept on repeating triumphantly: "The minimum of risk with the maximum of profit is my motto." What? He made my head ache, spoiled my tiffin, but got his own out of me all right. And as soon as I had shaken him off, I made straight for the waterside. I caught sight of Jim leaning over the parapet of the quay. 3 native boatmen quarrelling over 5 annas were making an awful row at his elbow. He didn't hear me come up, but spun round, as if the slight contact of my finger had released a catch. "I was looking," he stammered. I don't remember what I said, not much anyhow, but he made no difficulty in following me to the hotel. He followed me as manageable as a little child, with an obedient air, with no sort of manifestation, rather as though he had been waiting for me there to come along and carry him off. I need not have been so surprised as I was at his tractability. On all the round earth, which to some seems so big, and that others affect to consider as rather smaller than a mustard seed, he had no place where he could, what shall I say, where he could withdraw. That's it, withdraw, be alone with his loneliness. He walked by my side very calm, glancing here and there, and once turned his head to look after a city boy fireman in a cutaway coat and yellowish trousers, whose black face had silky gleams like a lump of anthracite coal. I doubt, however, whether he saw anything or even remained all the time aware of my companionship, because if I had not edged him to the left here, or pulled him to the right there, I believe he would have gone straight before him in any direction till stopped by a wall or some other obstacle. I steered him into my bedroom and sat down at once to write letters. This was the only place in the world, unless perhaps the Walpole Reef, but that was not so handy, where he could have it out with himself without being bothered by the rest of the universe. The damned thing, as he had expressed it, had not made him invisible, but I behaved exactly as though he were. No sooner in my chair, I bent over my writing desk like a medieval scribe, and but for the movement of the hand holding the pen, remained anxiously quiet. I can't say I was frightened, but I certainly kept as still as if there had been something dangerous in the room, that at the first hint of a movement on my part would be provoked to pounce upon me. There was not much in the room, you know how these bedrooms are, a sort of four-poster bedstead under a mosquito net, 2 or 3 chairs, the table I was writing at, a bare floor. A glass door opened on an upstairs veranda, and he stood with his face to it, having a hard time with all possible privacy. Dusk fell. I lit a candle with the greatest economy of movement, and as much prudence as though it were an illegal proceeding. There is no doubt that he had a very hard time of it, and so had I, even to the point, I must own, of wishing him to the devil, or on Walpole Reef at least. It occurred to me once or twice that, after all, Chester was, perhaps, the man to deal effectively with such a disaster. That strange idealist had found a practical use for it at once, unerringly, as it were. It was enough to make one suspect that maybe he really could see the true aspect of things that appeared mysterious or utterly hopeless to less imaginative persons. I wrote and wrote, I liquidated all the arrears of my correspondence, and then went on writing to people who had no reason whatever to expect from me a gossipy letter about nothing at all. At times I stole a sidelong glance. He was rooted to the spot, but convulsive shudders ran down his back. His shoulders would heave suddenly. He was fighting, mostly for his breath as it seemed. The massive shadows, cast all one way from the straight flame of the candle, seemed possessed of gloomy consciousness. The immobility of the furniture had to my furtive eye an air of attention. I was becoming fanciful in the midst of my industrious scribbling. And though, when the scratching of my pen stopped for a moment, there was complete silence and stillness in the room, I suffered from that profound disturbance and confusion of thought which is caused by a violent and menacing uproar, of a heavy gale at sea, for instance. Some of you may know what I mean, that mingled anxiety, distress, and irritation, with a sort of craven feeling creeping in, not pleasant to acknowledge, but which gives a quite special merit to one's endurance. I don't claim any merit for standing the stress of Jim's emotions. I could take refuge in the letters. I could have written to strangers if necessary. Suddenly, as I was taking up a fresh sheet of notepaper, I heard a low sound, the first sound that, since we had been shut up together, had come to my ears in the dim stillness of the room. I remained with my head down, with my hand arrested. Those who have kept vigil by a sick bed have heard such faint sounds in the stillness of the night watches, sounds wrung from a racked body, from a weary soul. He pushed the glass door with such force that all the panes rang. He stepped out, and I held my breath, straining my ears without knowing what else I expected to hear. He was really taking too much to heart an empty formality which, to Chester's rigorous criticism, seemed unworthy the notice of a man who could see things as they were. An empty formality, a piece of parchment. Well, well. As to an inaccessible guano deposit, that was another story altogether. One could intelligibly break one's heart over that. A feeble burst of many voices mingled with the tinkle of silver and glass floated up from the dining room below. Through the open door, the outer edge of the light from my candle fell on his back faintly. Beyond all was black. He stood on the brink of a vast obscurity, like a lonely figure by the shore of a sombre and hopeless ocean. There was the Walpole Reef in it, to be sure, a speck in the dark void, a straw for the drowning man. My compassion for him took the shape of the thought that I wouldn't have liked his people to see him at that moment. I found it trying myself. His back was no longer shaken by his gasps. He stood straight as an arrow, faintly visible and still, and the meaning of this stillness sank to the bottom of my soul like lead into the water, and made it so heavy that for a second I wished heartily that the only course left open for me was to pay for his funeral. Even the law had done with him. To bury him would have been such an easy kindness. It would have been so much in accordance with the wisdom of life, which consists in putting out of sight all the reminders of our folly, of our weakness, of our mortality, all that makes against our efficiency, the memory of our failures, the hints of our undying fears, the bodies of our dead friends. Perhaps he did take it too much to heart, and if so, then Chester's offer. At this point I took up a fresh sheet and began to write resolutely. There was nothing but myself between him and the dark ocean. I had a sense of responsibility. If I spoke, would that motionless and suffering youth leap into the obscurity, clutch at the straw? I found out how difficult it may be sometimes to make a sound. There is a weird power in a spoken word. And why the devil not? I was asking myself persistently while I drove on with my writing. All at once, on the blank page, under the very point of the pen, the two figures of Chester and his antique partner, very distinct and complete, would dodge into view with stride and gestures, as if reproduced in the field of some optical toy. I would watch them for a while. No. They were too phantasmal and extravagant to enter into anyone's fate. And a word carries far, very far, deals destruction through time as the bullets go flying through space. I said nothing, and he, out there with his back to the light, as if bound and gagged by all the invisible foes of man, made no stir and made no sound. Chapter 16. The time was coming when I should see him loved, trusted, admired, with a legend of strength and prowess forming round his name, as though he had been the stuff of a hero. It's true, I assure you, as true as I'm sitting here talking about him in vain. He, on his side, had that faculty of beholding at a hint the face of his desire and the shape of his dream, without which the earth would know no lover and no adventurer. He captured much honor and an Arcadian happiness, I won't say anything about innocence, in the bush, and it was as good to him as the honor and the Arcadian happiness of the streets to another man. Felicity, felicity, how shall I say it, is quaffed out of a golden cup in every latitude. The flavor is with you alone, and you can make it as intoxicating as you please. He was of the sort that would drink deep, as you may guess from what went before. I found him, if not exactly intoxicated, then at least flushed with the elixir at his lips. He had not obtained it at once. There had been, as you know, a period of probation amongst infernal ship-chandlers, during which he had suffered, and I had worried about my trust, you may call it. I don't know that I am completely reassured now, after beholding him in all his brilliance. That was my last view of him, in a strong light, dominating, and yet in complete accord with his surroundings, with the life of the forests, and with the life of men. I own that I was impressed, but I must admit to myself that after all this is not the lasting impression. He was protected by his isolation, alone of his own superior kind, in close touch with nature, that keeps faith on such easy terms with her lovers. But I cannot fix before my eye the image of his safety. I shall always remember him as seen through the open door of my room, taking perhaps too much to heart the mere consequences of his failure. I am pleased, of course, that some good, and even some splendor, came out of my endeavors, but at times it seems to me it would have been better for my peace of mind if I had not stood between him and Chester's confoundedly generous offer. I wonder what his exuberant imagination would have made of Walpole Islet, that most hopelessly forsaken crumb of dry land on the face of the waters. It is not likely I would ever have heard, for I must tell you that Chester, after calling at some Australian port to patch up his brig-rigged sea anachronism, steamed out into the Pacific with a crew of 22 hands all told, and the only news having a possible bearing upon the mystery of his fate was the news of a hurricane, which is supposed to have swept in its course over the Walpole Shoals a month or so afterwards. Not a vestige of the Argonauts ever turned up, not a sound came out of the waste. Phoenix. The Pacific is the most discreet of live, hot-tempered oceans. The chilly Antarctic can keep a secret too, but more in the manner of a grave. And there is a sense of blessed finality in such discretion, which is what we all more or less sincerely are ready to admit. For what else is it that makes the idea of death supportable? End, finis, the potent word that exorcises from the house of life the haunting shadow of fate. This is what, notwithstanding the testimony of my eyes and his own earnest assurances, I miss when I look back upon Jim's success. While there's life, there is hope truly, but there is fear too. I don't mean to say that I regret my action, nor will I pretend that I can't sleep o' nights in consequence. Still, the idea obtrudes itself that he made so much of his disgrace, while it is the guilt alone that matters. He was not, if I may say so, clear to me. He was not clear. And there is a suspicion he was not clear to himself either. There were his fine sensibilities, his fine feelings, his fine longings, a sort of sublimated, idealized selfishness. He was, if you allow me to say so, very fine, and very unfortunate. A little coarser nature would not have borne the strain. It would have had to come to terms with itself, with a sigh, with a grunt, or even with a guffaw. A still coarser one would have remained invulnerably ignorant and completely uninteresting. But he was too interesting or too unfortunate to be thrown to the dogs or even to Chester. I felt this while I sat with my face over the paper, and he fought and gasped, struggling for his breath in that terribly stealthy way, in my room. I felt it when he rushed out on the veranda as if to fling himself over, and didn't. I felt it more and more all the time he remained outside, faintly lighted on the background of night, as if standing on the shore of a sombre and hopeless sea. An abrupt heavy rumble made me lift my head. The noise seemed to roll away, and suddenly a searching and violent glare fell on the blind face of the night. The sustained and dazzling flickers seemed to last for an unconscionable time. The growl of the thunder increased steadily while I looked at him, distinct and black, planted solidly upon the shores of a sea of light. At the moment of greatest brilliance, The darkness leapt back with a culminating crash, and he vanished before my dazzled eyes as utterly as though he had been blown to atoms. A blustering sigh passed. Furious hands seemed to tear at the shrubs, shake the tops of the trees below, slam doors, break window panes, all along the front of the building. He stepped in, closing the door behind him, and found me bending over the table. My sudden anxiety as to what he would say was very great and akin to a fright. "May I have a cigarette?" he asked. I gave a push to the box without raising my head. "I want tobacco," he muttered. I became extremely buoyant. "Just a moment," I grunted pleasantly. He took a few steps here and there. "That's over," I heard him say. A single distant clap of thunder came from the sea like a gun of distress. "The monsoon breaks up early this year," he remarked conversationally, somewhere behind me. This encouraged me to turn round, which I did as soon as I had finished addressing the last envelope. He was smoking greedily in the middle of the room, and though he heard the stir I made, he remained with his back to me for a time. "Come, I carried it off pretty well," he said, wheeling suddenly. "Something's paid off, not much. I wonder what's to come." His face did not show any emotion, only it appeared a little darkened and swollen, as though he had been holding his breath. He smiled reluctantly, as it were, and went on while I gazed up at him mutely. "Thank you, though. Your room, jolly convenient, for a chap badly hipped." The rain pattered and swished in the garden. A water pipe, it must have had a hole in it, performed just outside the window a parody of blubbering woe with funny sobs and gurgling lamentations, interrupted by jerky spasms of silence. "A bit of shelter," he mumbled, and ceased. A flash of faded lightning darted in through the black framework of the windows and ebbed out without any noise. I was thinking how I had best approach him. I did not want to be flung off again, when he gave a little laugh. "No better than a vagabond now." The end of the cigarette smouldered between his fingers. "Without a single," he pronounced slowly, "and yet—" He paused. The rain fell with redoubled violence. "Some day one's bound to come upon some sort of chance to get it all back again. Must," he whispered distinctly, glaring at my boots. I did not even know what it was he wished so much to regain, what it was he had so terribly missed. It might have been so much that it was impossible to say. A piece of ass's skin, according to Chester. He looked up at me inquisitively. "Perhaps." "If life's long enough," I muttered through my teeth with unreasonable animosity. "Don't reckon too much on it." "Jove, I feel as if nothing could ever touch me," he said, in a tone of somber conviction. "If this business couldn't knock me over, then there's no fear of there being not enough time to climb out and—" He looked upwards. "It struck me that it is from such as he that the great army of waifs and strays is recruited, the army that marches down into all the gutters of the earth. As soon as he left my room, that bit of shelter, he would take his place in the ranks and begin the journey towards the bottomless pit." I at least had no illusions, but it was I, too, who a moment ago had been so sure of the power of words, and now was afraid to speak. In the same way, one dares not move for fear of losing a slippery hold. It is when we try to grapple with another man's intimate need that we perceive how incomprehensible, wavering, and misty are the beings that share with us the sight of the stars and the warmth of the sun. It is as if loneliness were a hard and absolute condition of existence. The envelope of flesh and blood on which our eyes are fixed melts before the outstretched hand, and there remains only the capricious, unconsolable, and elusive spirit that no eye can follow, no hand can grasp. It was the fear of losing him that kept me silent, for it was borne upon me suddenly and with unaccountable force that should I let him slip away into the darkness, I would never forgive myself. Well, thanks, once more. You've been, uh, uncommonly, really there's no word to, uncommonly, I don't know why, I am sure. I'm afraid I don't feel as grateful as I would if the whole thing hadn't been so brutally sprung on me. Because at bottom, you, yourself, he stuttered. Possibly, I struck in. He frowned. All the same, one is responsible. He watched me like a hawk. And that's true too, I said. Well, I've gone with it to the end, and I don't intend to let any man cast it in my teeth without resenting it. He clenched his fist. There's yourself, I said with a smile, mirthless enough, God knows. But he looked at me menacingly. That's my business, he said. An air of indomitable resolution came and went upon his face like a vain and passing shadow. Next moment he looked a dear good boy in trouble as before. He flung away the cigarette. Goodbye, he said, with the sudden haste of a man who had lingered too long in view of a pressing bit of work waiting for him. And then, for a second or so, he made not the slightest movement. The downpour fell with the heavy, uninterrupted rush of a sweeping flood, with a sound of unchecked, overwhelming fury that called to one's mind the images of collapsing bridges, of uprooted trees, of undermined mountains. No man could breast the colossal and headlong stream that seemed to break and swirl against the dim stillness in which we were precariously sheltered as if on an island. The perforated pipe gurgled, choked, spat, and splashed in odious ridicule of a swimmer fighting for his life. It is raining, I remonstrated, and I— Rain or shine, he began brusquely, checked himself, and walked to the window. Perfect deluge, he muttered after a while. He leaned his forehead on the glass. It's dark, too. Yes, it is very dark, I said. He pivoted on his heels, crossed the room, and had actually opened the door leading into the corridor before I leaped up from my chair. Wait, I cried. I want you to— I can't dine with you again tonight, he flung at me, with one leg out of the room already. I haven't the slightest intention to ask you, I shouted. At this, he drew back his foot, but remained mistrustfully in the very doorway. I lost no time in entreating him earnestly not to be absurd, to come in and shut the door. Chapter 17. He came in at last, but I believe it was mostly the rain that did it. It was falling just then with a devastating violence which quieted down gradually while we talked. His manner was very sober and set. His bearing was that of a naturally taciturn man possessed by an idea. My talk was of the material aspect of his position. It had the sole aim of saving him from the degradation, ruin, and despair that out there close so swiftly upon a friendless, homeless man. I pleaded with him to accept my help. I argued reasonably, and every time I looked up at that absorbed, smooth face, so grave and youthful, I had a disturbing sense of being no help, but rather an obstacle to some mysterious, inexplicable, impalpable striving of his wounded spirit. I suppose you intend to eat and drink and to sleep under shelter in the usual way, I remember saying with irritation. You say you won't touch the money that is due to you. He came as near as his sort can to making a gesture of horror. There were 3 weeks and 5 days' pay owing him as mate of the Patna. Well, that's too little to matter anyhow, but what will you do tomorrow? Where will you turn? You must live. That isn't the thing, was the comment that escaped him under his breath. I ignored it and went on combating what I assumed to be the scruples of an exaggerated delicacy. On every conceivable ground, I concluded, you must let me help you. You can't, he said very simply and gently, and holding fast to some deep idea which I could detect shimmering like a pool of water in the dark, but which I despaired of ever approaching near enough to fathom. I surveyed his well-proportioned bulk. At any rate, I said, I am able to help what I can see of you. I don't pretend to do more." He shook his head skeptically without looking at me. I got very warm. "But I can," I insisted. "I can do even more. I am doing more. I am trusting you." "The money," he began. "Upon my word, you deserve being told to go to the devil," I cried, forcing the note of indignation. He was startled, smiled, and I pressed my attack home. "It isn't a question of money at all. You are too superficial," I said, and at the same time I was thinking to myself, well, here goes. And perhaps he is, after all. "Look at the letter I want you to take. I am writing to a man of whom I've never asked a favor, and I am writing about you in terms that one only ventures to use when speaking of an intimate friend. I make myself unreservedly responsible for you. That's what I am doing. And really, if you will only reflect a little what that means." He lifted his head. The rain had passed away. Only the water pipe went on shedding tears with an absurd drip, drip outside the window. It was very quiet in the room, whose shadows huddled together in corners, away from the still flame of the candle, flaring upright in the shape of a dagger. His face, after a while, seemed suffused by a reflection of a soft light, as if the dawn had broken already. "Jove!" he gasped out. "It is noble of you!" Had he suddenly put out his tongue at me in derision, I could not have felt more humiliated. I thought to myself, serve me right for a sneaking humbug. His eyes shone straight into my face, but I perceived it was not a mocking brightness. All at once he sprang into jerky agitation, like one of those flat wooden figures that are worked by a string. His arms went up, then came down with a slap. He became another man altogether. "And I had never seen," he shouted, then suddenly bit his lip and frowned. "What a bally ass I've been," he said, very slow, in an awed tone. "You are a brick," he cried next in a muffled voice. He snatched my hand, as though he had just then seen it for the first time, and dropped it at once. "Why, this is what he stammered, and then with a return of his old stolid, I may say mulish, manner he began heavily. "I would be a brute now if I—" And then his voice seemed to break. "That's all right," I said. I was almost alarmed by this display of feeling, through which pierced a strange elation. I had pulled the string accidentally, as it were. I did not fully understand the working of the toy. "I must go now," he said. "Jove, you have helped me. Can't sit still. The very thing—" He looked at me with puzzled admiration. "The very thing—" Of course it was the thing. It was 10 to 1 that I had saved him from starvation, of that peculiar sort that is almost invariably associated with drink. This was all. I had not a single illusion on that score. But looking at him, I allowed myself to wonder at the nature of the one he had, within the last 3 minutes, so evidently taken into his bosom. I had forced into his hand the means to carry on decently the serious business of life, to get food, drink, and shelter of the customary kind, while his wounded spirit, like a bird with a broken wing, might hop and flutter into some hole to die quietly of inanition there. This is what I had thrust upon him, a definitely small thing, and behold, by the manner of its reception, it loomed in the dim light of the candle like a big, indistinct, perhaps a dangerous shadow. "You don't mind me not saying anything appropriate?" he burst out. "There isn't anything one could say. Last night already you had done me no end of good. Listening to me, you know, I give you my word I've thought more than once the top of my head would fly off." He darted, positively darted, here and there, rammed his hands into his pockets, jerked them out again, flung his cap on his head. I had no idea it was in him to be so airily brisk. I thought of a dry leaf imprisoned in an eddy of wind, while a mysterious apprehension, a load of indefinite doubt, weighed me down in my chair. He stood stock still, as if struck motionless by a discovery. "You have given me confidence," he declared, soberly. "Oh, for God's sake, my dear fellow, don't," I entreated, as though he had hurt me. "All right, I'll shut up now and henceforth. Can't prevent me thinking, though. Never mind. I'll show yet." He went to the door in a hurry, paused with his head down, and came back, stepping deliberately. "I always thought that if a fellow could begin with a clean slate, and now you, in a measure, yes, clean slate." I waved my hand, and he marched out without looking back. The sound of his footfalls died out gradually behind the closed door, the unhesitating tread of a man walking in broad daylight. But as to me, left alone with the solitary candle, I remained strangely unenlightened. I was no longer young enough to behold at every turn the magnificence that besets our insignificant footsteps in good and in evil. I smiled to think that after all it was yet he of us two who had the light, and I felt sad. A clean slate, did he say? As if the initial word of each our destiny were not graven in imperishable characters upon the face of a rock. Chapter 18. 6 months afterwards, my friend, he was a cynical, more than middle-aged bachelor with a reputation for eccentricity and owned a rice mill, wrote to me, and judging from the warmth of my recommendation that I would like to hear, enlarged a little upon Jim's perfections. These were apparently of a quiet and effective sort. Not having been able so far to find more in my heart than a resigned toleration for any individual of my kind, I have lived till now alone in a house that even in this steaming climate could be considered as too big for one man. I have had him to live with me for some time past. It seems I haven't made a mistake. It seemed to me on reading this letter that my friend had found in his heart more than tolerance for Jim, that there were the beginnings of active liking. Of course, he stated his grounds in a characteristic way. For one thing, Jim kept his freshness in the climate. Had he been a girl, my friend wrote, one could have said he was blooming modestly, like a violet, not like some of these blatant tropical flowers. He had been in the house for 6 weeks, and had not as yet attempted to slap him on the back, or address him as old boy, or try to make him feel a superannuated fossil. He had nothing of the exasperating young man's chatter. He was good-tempered, had not much to say for himself, was not clever by any means, thank goodness, wrote my friend. It appeared, however, that Jim was clever enough to be quietly appreciative of his wit, while, on the other hand, he amused him by his naiveness. The dew is yet on him, and since I had the bright idea of giving him a room in the house and having him at meals, I feel less withered myself. The other day, he took it into his head to cross the room with no other purpose but to open a door for me, and I felt more in touch with mankind than I had been for years. Ridiculous, isn't it? Of course, I guess there is something, some awful little scrape which you know all about, but if I am sure that it is terribly heinous, I fancy one could manage to forgive it. For my part, I declare I am unable to imagine him guilty of anything much worse than robbing an orchard. Is it much worse? Perhaps you ought to have told me, but it is such a long time since we both turned saints that you may have forgotten we, too, had sinned in our time. It may be that some day I shall have to ask you, and then I shall expect to be told. I don't care to question him myself till I have some idea what it is. Moreover, it's too soon as yet. Let him open the door a few times more for me. Thus, my friend, I was trebly pleased at Jim's shaping so well, at the tone of the letter, at my own cleverness. Evidently I had known what I was doing. I had read characters aright and so on. And what if something unexpected and wonderful were to come of it? That evening, reposing in a deck chair under the shade of my own poop awning, it was in Hong Kong harbour, I laid on Jim's behalf the first stone of a castle in Spain. I made a trip to the northward, and when I returned, I found another letter from my friend waiting for me. It was the first envelope I tore open. There are no spoons missing, as far as I know, ran the first line. "I haven't been interested enough to inquire. He is gone, leaving on the breakfast table a formal little note of apology, which is either silly or heartless. Probably both. And it's all one to me. Allow me to say, lest you should have some more mysterious young men in reserve, that I have shut up shop, definitely and forever. This is the last eccentricity I shall be guilty of. Do not imagine for a moment that I care a hang, but he is very much regretted at tennis parties, and for my own sake I've told a plausible lie at the club." I flung the letter aside and started looking through the batch on my table till I came upon Jim's handwriting. Would you believe it? 1 chance in 100, but it is always that 100th chance. That little second engineer of the Patna had turned up in a more or less destitute state and got a temporary job of looking after the machinery of the mill. "I couldn't stand the familiarity of the little beast," Jim wrote from a seaport 700 miles south of the place where he should have been in clover. "I am now for the time with Eggstrom and Blake, ship chandlers, as their, runner, to call the thing by its right name. For reference I gave them your name, which they know, of course, and if you could write a word in my favor, it would be a permanent employment." I was utterly crushed under the ruins of my castle, but of course I wrote as desired. Before the end of the year my new charter took me that way, and I had an opportunity of seeing him. He was still with Eggstrom and Blake, and we met in what they called our parlor, opening out of the store. He had that moment come in from boarding a ship and confronted me head down, ready for a tussle. "What have you got to say for yourself?" I began as soon as we had shaken hands. "What I wrote you? Nothing more," he said stubbornly. "Did the fellow blab, or what?" I asked. He looked up at me with a troubled smile. "Oh, no, he didn't. He made it a kind of confidential business between us. He was most damnably mysterious whenever I came over to the mill. He would wink at me in a respectful manner, as much as to say, 'We know what we know.' Infernally fawning and familiar, and that sort of thing." He threw himself into a chair and stared down his legs. "One day we happened to be alone, and the fellow had the cheek to say, 'Well, Mr. James, I was called Mr. James there, as if I had been the son. Here we are together once more. This is better than the old ship, ain't it? Wasn't it appalling, eh?' I looked at him, and he put on a knowing air. 'Don't you be uneasy, sir,' he says. 'I know a gentleman when I see one, and I know how a gentleman feels. I hope, though, you will be keeping me on this job. I had a hard time of it, too, along of that rotten old Patna racket. Jove, it was awful. I don't know what I should have said or done if I had not just then heard Mr. Denver calling me in the passage. It was tiffin time, and we walked together across the yard and through the garden to the bungalow. He began to chaff me in his kindly way. I believe he liked me." Jim was silent for a while. "I know he liked me. That's what made it so hard. Such a splendid man. That morning he slipped his hand under my arm. He too was familiar with me." He burst into a short laugh and dropped his chin on his breast. "Pah! When I remembered how that mean little beast had been talking to me," he began suddenly in a vibrating voice, "I couldn't bear to think of myself. I suppose you know—" I nodded. "More like a father," he cried. His voice sank. I would have had to tell him. I couldn't let it go on, could I? "Well," I murmured, after waiting a while. "I preferred to go," he said slowly. "This thing must be buried." We could hear in the shop Blake upbraiding Eggstrom in an abusive, strained voice. They had been associated for many years, and every day, from the moment the doors were opened to the last minute before closing, Blake, a little man with sleek, jetty hair and unhappy, beady eyes, could be heard rowing his partner incessantly with a sort of scathing and plaintive fury. The sound of that everlasting scolding was part of the place like the other fixtures. Even strangers would very soon come to disregard it completely, unless it be perhaps to mutter "nuisance," or to get up suddenly and shut the door of the parlour. Ekstrom himself, a raw-boned, heavy Scandinavian with a busy manner and immense blonde whiskers, went on directing his people, checking parcels, making out bills or writing letters at a stand-up desk in the shop, and comported himself in that clatter exactly as though he had been stone-deaf. Now and again he would emit a bothered perfunctory shh, which neither produced nor was expected to produce the slightest effect. "They are very decent to me here," said Jim. "Blake's a little cad, but Egstrom's all right." He stood up quickly, and walking with measured steps to a tripod telescope standing in the window and pointed at the roadstead, he applied his eye to it. "There's that ship, which has been becalmed outside all the morning, has got a breeze now and is coming in," he remarked patiently. "I must go and board." We shook hands in silence, and he turned to go. "Jim!" I cried. He looked round with his hand on the lock. You have thrown away something like a fortune." He came back to me all the way from the door. "Such a splendid old chap," he said. "How could I? How could I?" His lips twitched. "Here it does not matter." "Oh, you," I began, and had to cast about for a suitable word, but before I became aware that there was no name that would just do, he was gone. I heard outside Ekstrom's deep, gentle voice saying cheerily, "That's the Sarah W. Granger, Jimmy. You must manage to be first aboard." And directly, Blake struck in, screaming after the manner of an outraged cockatoo. "Tell the captain we've got some of his mail here. That'll fetch him. Do you hear, Mr. What's-Your-Name?" And there was Jim answering Egstrom with something boyish in his tone. "All right, I'll make a race of it." He seemed to take refuge in the boat-sailing part of that sorry business. I did not see him again that trip, but on my next I had a 6-month charter. I went up to the store. 10 yards away from the door, Blake's scolding met my ears, and when I came in, he gave me a glance of utter wretchedness. Egstrom, all smiles, advanced, extending a large, bony hand. "Glad to see you, Captain." "Shh. Been thinking you were about due back here." "What did you say, sir?" "Shh. Oh, him. He has left us. Come into the parlour." After the slam of the door, Blake's strained voice became faint, as the voice of one scolding desperately in a wilderness. "Put us to a great inconvenience, too. Used us badly, I must say." "Where's he gone to?" "Do you know?" I asked. "No, it's no use asking either," said Egstrom, standing bewhiskered and obliging before me, with his arms hanging down his sides clumsily, and a thin silver watch-chain looped very low on a rucked-up blue serge waistcoat. "A man like that don't go anywhere in particular." I was too concerned at the news to ask for the explanation of that pronouncement, and he went on. "He left, let's see, the very day a steamer with returning pilgrims from the Red Sea put in here with 2 blades of her propeller gone. 3 weeks ago now." "Wasn't there something said about the Patna case?" I asked, fearing the worst. He gave a start, and looked at me as if I had been a sorcerer. "Why, yes. How do you know? Some of them were talking about it here. There was a captain or two, the manager of Van Loo's engineering shop at the harbour, 2 or 3 others, and myself. Jim was in here too, having a sandwich and a glass of beer. When we are busy, you see, Captain, there's no time for a proper tiffin. He was standing by this table eating sandwiches, and the rest of us were round the telescope watching that steamer come in. And by, Van Loo's manager began to talk about the chief of the Patna. He had done some repairs for him once, and from that he went on to tell us what an old ruin she was, and the money that had been made out of her. He came to mention her last voyage, and then we all struck in. Some said one thing and some another, not much, what you or any other man might say, and there was some laughing. Captain O'Brien of the Sarah W. Granger, a large, noisy old man with a stick, he was sitting listening to us in this armchair here. He let drive suddenly with his stick at the floor, and roars out, "Skunks!" Made us all jump. Van Loo's manager winks at us and asks, What's the matter, Captain O'Brien? Matter! Matter! The old man began to shout. What are you Injuns laughing at? It's no laughing matter. It's a disgrace to human nature, that's what it is. I would despise being seen in the same room with one of those men. Yes, sir. He seemed to catch my eye like, and I had to speak out of civility. Skunks, says I. Of course, Captain O'Brien. And I wouldn't care to have them here myself. So you're quite safe in this room, Captain O'Brien. Have a little something cool to drink. Damn your drink, Eggstrom, says he with a twinkle in his eye. When I want a drink, I will shout for it. I'm going to quit. It stinks here now. At this, all the others burst out laughing, and out they go after the old man. And then, sir, that blasted Jim, he puts down the sandwich he had in his hand and walks round the table to me. There was his glass of beer poured out quite full. I am off, he says, just like this. It isn't 1:30 yet, says I. You might snatch a smoke first. I thought he meant it was time for him to go down to his work. When I understood what he was up to, my arms fell. So, can't get a man like that every day, you know, sir. A regular devil for sailing a boat, ready to go out miles to sea to meet ships in any sort of weather. More than once a captain would come in here full of it, and the first thing he would say would be, "That's a reckless sort of a lunatic you've got for water clerk, Eggstrom." I was feeling my way in at daylight under short canvas when there comes flying out of the mist right under my forefoot a boat half under water, sprays going over the masthead, 2 frightened niggers on the bottom boards, a yelling fiend at the tiller. Hey! Hey! Ship ahoy! Ahoy! Captain! Hey! Hey! Eggstrom and Blake's man first to speak to you. Hey! Hey! Eggstrom and Blake! Hello! Hey! Whoop! Kick the niggers. Out reefs, a squall on at the time, shoots ahead, whooping and yelling to me to make sail, and he would give me a lead-in. More like a demon than a man. Never saw a boat handled like that in all my life. Couldn't have been drunk, was he? Such a quiet, soft-spoken chap, too. Blushed like a girl when he came on board. I tell you, Captain Marlowe, nobody had a chance against us with a strange ship when Jim was out. The other ship chandlers just kept their old customers and— Eggstrom appeared overcome with emotion. Why, sir, it seemed as though he wouldn't mind going 100 miles out to sea in an old shoe to nab a ship for the firm. If the business had been his own and all to make yet, he couldn't have done more in that way. And now, all at once, like this, thinks I to myself, oh ho, a rise in the screw, that's the trouble, is it? All right, says I. No need of all that fuss with me, Jimmy. Just mention your figure. Anything in reason. He looks at me as if he wanted to swallow something that's stuck in his throat. I can't stop with you. What's that blooming joke? I asks. He shakes his head, and I could see in his eye he was as good as gone already, sir. So I turned to him and slanged him till all was blue. What is it you're running away from? I asks. Who has been getting at you? What scared you? You haven't as much sense as a rat. They don't clear out from a good ship. Where do you expect to get a better berth? You this and you that. I made him look sick, I can tell you. This business ain't going to sink, says I. He gave a big jump. Goodbye, he says, nodding at me like a lord. You ain't half a bad chap, Eggstrom. I give you my word that if you knew my reasons, you wouldn't care to keep me. That's the biggest lie you ever told in your life, says I. I know my own mind. He made me so mad that I had to laugh. Can't you really stop long enough to drink this glass of beer here, you funny beggar, you? I don't know what came over him. He didn't seem able to find the door. Something comical, I can tell you, Captain. I drank the beer myself. Well, if you're in such a hurry, here's luck to you in your own drink, says I. Only you mark my words. If you keep up this game, you'll very soon find that the earth ain't big enough to hold you. That's all. He gave me one black look, and out he rushed with a face fit to scare little children. Eggstrom snorted bitterly and combed one auburn whisker with knotty fingers. Haven't been able to get a man that was any good since. It's nothing but worry, worry, worry and business. And where might you have come across him, Captain, if it's fair to ask? He was the mate of the Patna that voyage, I said, feeling that I owed some explanation. For a time, Egstrom remained very still, with his fingers plunged in the hair at the side of his face, and then exploded. And who the devil cares about that? I dare say no one, I began. And what the devil is he, anyhow, for to go on like this? He stuffed suddenly his left whisker into his mouth and stood amazed. Gee, he exclaimed, I told him the earth wouldn't be big enough to hold his caper. Chapter 19. I have told you these 2 episodes at length to show his manner of dealing with himself under the new conditions of his life. There were many others of the sort, more than I could count on the fingers of my 2 hands. They were all equally tinged by a high-minded absurdity of intention which made their futility profound and touching. To fling away your daily bread so as to get your hands free for a grapple with a ghost may be an act of prosaic heroism. Men had done it before, though we who have lived know full well that it is not the haunted soul but the hungry body that makes an outcast, and men who had eaten and meant to eat every day had applauded the creditable folly. He was indeed unfortunate, for all his recklessness could not carry him out from under the shadow. There was always a doubt of his courage. The truth seems to be that it is impossible to lay the ghost of a fact. You can face it or shirk it. And I have come across a man or two who could wink at their familiar shades. Obviously Jim was not of the winking sort, but what I could never make up my mind about was whether his line of conduct amounted to shirking his ghost or to facing him out. I strained my mental eyesight only to discover that, as with the complexion of all our actions, the shade of difference was so delicate that it was impossible to say. It might have been flight, and it might have been a mode of combat. To the common mind he became known as a rolling stone, because this was the funniest part. He did after a time become perfectly known, and even notorious, within the circle of his wanderings, which had a diameter of, say, 3,000 miles, in the same way as an eccentric character is known to a whole countryside. For instance, in Bangkok, where he found employment with Yucca brothers, charterers, and teak merchants, it was almost pathetic to see him go about in sunshine, hugging his secret, which was known to the very up-country logs on the river. Schomburg, the keeper of the hotel where he boarded, a hirsute Alsatian of manly bearing and an irrepressible retailer of all the scandalous gossip of the place, would, with both elbows on the table, impart an adorned version of the story to any guest who cared to imbibe knowledge along with the more costly liquors. And mind you, the nicest fellow you could meet, would be his generous conclusion, quite superior. It says a lot for the casual crowd that frequented Schomburg's establishment that Jim managed to hang out in Bangkok for a whole 6 months. I remarked that people, perfect strangers, took to him as one takes to a nice child. His manner was reserved, but it was as though his personal appearance, his hair, his eyes, his smile, made friends for him wherever he went. And of course, he was no fool. I heard Siegmund Yucca, native of Switzerland, a gentle creature ravaged by a cruel dyspepsia, and so frightfully lame that his head swung through a quarter of a circle at every step he took, declare appreciatively that for one so young he was of great gabacity, as though it had been a mere question of cubic contents. Why not send him up country? I suggested anxiously. Yucca brothers had concessions and teak forests in the interior. If he has capacity, as you say, he will soon get hold of the work, and physically he is very fit. His health is always excellent. Ah, it's a great thing in this gowndry to be vrivrom dyspepsia, sighed poor Yucca enviously, casting a stealthy glance at the pit of his ruined stomach. I left him drumming pensively on his desk and muttering, Es ist eine Idee, es ist eine Idee. Unfortunately, That very evening an unpleasant affair took place in the hotel. I don't know that I blame Jim very much, but it was a truly regrettable incident. It belonged to the lamentable species of barroom scuffles, and the other party to it was a cross-eyed Dane of sorts, whose visiting card recited, under his misbegotten name, First Lieutenant in the Royal Siamese Navy. The fellow, of course, was utterly hopeless at billiards, but did not like to be beaten, I suppose. He had had enough to drink to turn nasty after the sixth game and make some scornful remark at Jim's expense. Most of the people there didn't hear what was said, and those who had heard seemed to have had all precise recollection scared out of them by the appalling nature of the consequences that immediately ensued. It was very lucky for the Dane that he could swim, because the room opened on a veranda and the Menam flowed below very wide and black. A boatload of Chinamen, bound, as likely as not on some thieving expedition, fished out the officer of the King of Siam, and Jim turned up at about midnight on board my ship without a hat. Everybody in the room seemed to know, he said, gasping yet from the contest, as it were. He was rather sorry, on general principles, for what had happened, though in this case there had been, he said, no option. But what dismayed him was to find the nature of his burden as well known to everybody as though he had gone about all that time carrying it on his shoulders. Naturally, after this, he couldn't remain in the place. He was universally condemned for the brutal violence, so unbecoming a man in his delicate position. Some maintained he had been disgracefully drunk at the time. Others criticized his want of tact. Even Schomburg was very much annoyed. "He is a very nice young man," he said argumentatively to me, "but the lieutenant is a first-rate fellow too. He dines every night at my table d'hôte, you know. And there's a billiard cue broken. I can't allow that. First thing this morning I went over with my apologies to the lieutenant, and I think I've made it all right for myself, but only think, Captain, if everybody started such games, why, the man might have been drowned. And here I can't run out into the next street and buy a new cue. I've got to write to Europe for them. No, no, a temper like that won't do." He was extremely sore on the subject. This was the worst incident of all in his retreat. Nobody could deplore it more than myself, for if, as somebody said hearing him mentioned, "Oh, yes, I know, he has knocked about a good deal out here," yet he had somehow avoided being battered and chipped in the process. This last affair, however, made me seriously uneasy, because if his exquisite sensibilities were to go the length of involving him in pothouse shindies, he would lose his name of an inoffensive, if aggravating, fool, and acquire that of a common loafer. For all my confidence in him, I could not help reflecting that in such cases, from the name to the thing itself is but a step. I suppose you will understand that by that time I could not think of washing my hands of him. I took him away from Bangkok in my ship, and we had a longish passage. It was pitiful to see how he shrank within himself. A seaman, even if a mere passenger, takes an interest in a ship and looks at the sea life around him with the critical enjoyment of a painter, for instance, looking at another man's work. In every sense of the expression he is on deck. But my Jim, for the most part, skulked down below as though he had been a stowaway. He infected me so that I avoided speaking on professional matters, such as would suggest themselves naturally to two sailors during a passage. For whole days we did not exchange a word. I felt extremely unwilling to give orders to my officers in his presence. Often, when alone with him on deck or in the cabin, we didn't know what to do with our eyes. I placed him with De Jong, as you know, glad enough to dispose of him in any way, yet persuaded that his position was now growing intolerable. He had lost some of that elasticity which had enabled him to rebound back into his uncompromising position after every overthrow. One day, coming ashore, I saw him standing on the quay. The water of the roadstead and the sea in the offing made one smooth ascending plain, and the outermost ships at anchor seemed to ride motionless in the sky. He was waiting for his boat, which was being loaded at our feet with packages of small stores for some vessel ready to leave. After exchanging greetings, we remained silent, side by side. "Jove," he said suddenly, "this is killing work." He smiled at me. I must say he generally could manage a smile. I made no reply. I knew very well he was not alluding to his duties. He had an easy time of it with De Jong. Nevertheless, as soon as he had spoken, I became completely convinced that the work was killing. I did not even look at him. "Would you like," said I, "to leave this part of the world altogether? Try California or the West Coast. I'll see what I can do." He interrupted me a little scornfully. "What difference would it make?" I felt at once convinced that he was right. It would make no difference. It was not relief he wanted. I seemed to perceive dimly that what he wanted, what he was, as it were, waiting for, was something not easy to define, something in the nature of an opportunity. I had given him many opportunities, but they had been merely opportunities to earn his bread. Yet what more could any man do? The position struck me as hopeless, and poor Brearley's saying recurred to me, "Let him creep 20 feet underground and stay there." Better that, I thought, than this waiting above ground for the impossible. Yet one could not be sure even of that. There and then, before his boat was 3 oars' lengths away from the quay, I had made up my mind to go and consult Stein in the evening. This Stein was a wealthy and respected merchant. His house, because it was a house, Stein and Company, and there was some sort of partner who, as Stein said, looked after the Moluccas, had a large inter-island business, with a lot of trading posts established in the most out-of-the-way places for collecting the produce. His wealth and his respectability were not exactly the reasons why I was anxious to seek his advice. I desired to confide my difficulty to him because he was one of the most trustworthy men I had ever known. The gentle light of a simple, unwearied, as it were, and intelligent good nature illumined his long, hairless face. It had deep downward folds, and was pale as of a man who had always led a sedentary life, which was indeed very far from being the case. His hair was thin, and brushed back from a massive and lofty forehead. One fancied that at 20 he must have looked very much like what he was now at 60. It was a student's face, only the eyebrows, nearly all white, thick and bushy, together with the resolute searching glance that came from under them, were not in accord with his, I may say, learned appearance. He was tall and loose-jointed. His slight stoop, together with an innocent smile, made him appear benevolently ready to lend you his ear. His long arms, with pale, big hands, had rare deliberate gestures of a pointing out, demonstrating kind. I speak of him at length because under this exterior, and in conjunction with an upright and indulgent nature, this man possessed an intrepidity of spirit and a physical courage that could have been called reckless had it not been, like a natural function of the body, say good digestion, for instance, completely unconscious of itself. It is sometimes said of a man that he carries his life in his hand. Such a saying would have been inadequate if applied to him. During the early part of his existence in the East, he had been playing ball with it. All this was in the past, but I knew the story of his life and the origin of his fortune. He was also a naturalist of some distinction, or perhaps I should say a learned collector. Entomology was his special study. His collection of Buprestidae and longicorns, beetles all, horrible miniature monsters, looking malevolent in death and immobility, and his cabinet of butterflies, beautiful and hovering under the glass of cases on lifeless wings, had spread his fame far over the earth. The name of this merchant, adventurer, sometime adviser of a Malay sultan, to whom he never alluded otherwise than as "my poor Mohammed Bonso," had, on account of a few bushels of dead insects, become known to learned persons in Europe who could have had no conception, and certainly would not have cared to know anything, of his life or character. I, who knew, considered him an eminently suitable person to receive my confidences about Jim's difficulties as well as my own. Chapter 20. Late in the evening I entered his study after traversing an imposing but empty dining room very dimly lit. The house was silent. I was preceded by an elderly grim Javanese servant in a sort of livery of white jacket and yellow sarong, who, after throwing the door open, exclaimed low, "Oh, master!" and stepping aside, vanished in a mysterious way as though he had been a ghost only momentarily embodied for that particular service. Stein turned round with the chair, and in the same movement his spectacles seemed to get pushed up on his forehead. He welcomed me in his quiet and humorous voice. Only one corner of the vast room, the corner in which stood his writing desk, was strongly lighted by a shaded reading lamp, and the rest of the spacious apartment melted into shapeless gloom like a cavern. Narrow shelves filled with dark boxes of uniform shape and color ran round the walls, not from floor to ceiling, but in a somber belt about 4 feet broad. Catacombs of beetles. Wooden tablets were hung above at irregular intervals. The light reached one of them, and the word Coleoptera, written in gold letters, glittered mysteriously upon a vast dimness. The glass cases containing the collection of butterflies were ranged in 3 long rows upon slender-legged little tables. One of these cases had been removed from its place and stood on the desk, which was bestrewn with oblong slips of paper, blackened with minute handwriting. "So you see me. So," he said. His hand hovered over the case where a butterfly in solitary grandeur spread out dark bronze wings, 7 inches or more across, with exquisite white veinings and a gorgeous border of yellow spots. "Only one specimen like this they have in your London, and then no more. To my small native town this my collection I shall bequeath. Something of me, the best." He bent forward in the chair and gazed intently, his chin over the front of the case. I stood at his back. "Marvelous," he whispered, and seemed to forget my presence. His history was curious. He had been born in Bavaria, and when a youth of 22 had taken an active part in the revolutionary movement of 1848. Heavily compromised, he managed to make his escape, and at first found a refuge with a poor Republican watchmaker in Trieste. From there, he made his way to Tripoli with a stock of cheap watches to hawk about. Not a very great opening, truly, but it turned out lucky enough, because it was there he came upon a Dutch traveller, a rather famous man, I believe, but I don't remember his name. It was that naturalist who, engaging him as a sort of assistant, took him to the East. They travelled in the archipelago together and separately, collecting insects and birds for 4 years or more. Then the naturalist went home, and Stein, having no home to go to, remained with an old trader he had come across in his journeys in the interior of Celebes, if Celebes may be said to have an interior. This old Scotsman, the only white man allowed to reside in the country at the time, was a privileged friend of the chief ruler of Wajo's states, who was a woman. I often heard Stein relate how that chap, who was slightly paralyzed on one side, had introduced him to the native court a short time before another stroke carried him off. He was a heavy man with a patriarchal white beard and of imposing stature. He came into the council hall where all the Rajas, Pangerans, and headmen were assembled with the queen, a fat, wrinkled woman, very free in her speech, Stein said, reclining on a high couch under a canopy. He dragged his leg, thumping with his stick, and grasped Stein's arm, leading him right up to the couch. "Look, Queen, and you Rajas, this is my son," he proclaimed in a stentorian voice. "I have traded with your fathers, and when I die, he shall trade with you and your sons." By means of this simple formality, Stein inherited the Scotsman's privileged position and all his stock in trade, together with a fortified house on the banks of the only navigable river in the country. Shortly afterwards, the old queen, who was so free in her speech, died, and the country became disturbed by various pretenders to the throne. Stein joined the party of a younger son, the one of whom, 30 years later, he never spoke otherwise but as my poor Mohammed Bonso. They both became the heroes of innumerable exploits. They had wonderful adventures, and once stood a siege in the Scotsman's house for a month, with only a score of followers against a whole army. I believe the natives talk of that war to this day. Meantime, it seems, Stein never failed to annex on his own account every butterfly or beetle he could lay hands on. After some 8 years of war, negotiations, false truces, sudden outbreaks, reconciliation, treachery, and so on, and just as peace seemed at last permanently established, his poor Mohammed Bonso was assassinated at the gate of his own royal residence while dismounting in the highest spirits on his return from a successful deer hunt. This event rendered Stein's position extremely insecure, but he would have stayed, perhaps, had it not been that a short time afterwards he lost Mohammed's sister. My dear wife, the princess, he used to say solemnly, by whom he had had a daughter, mother and child, both dying within 3 days of each other from some infectious fever. He left the country, which this cruel loss had made unbearable to him. Thus ended the first and adventurous part of his existence. What followed was so different that but for the reality of sorrow which remained with him, this strange part must have resembled a dream. He had a little money. He started life afresh, and in the course of years acquired a considerable fortune. At first he had travelled a good deal amongst the islands, but age had stolen upon him, and of late he seldom left his spacious house 3 miles out of town, with an extensive garden and surrounded by stables, offices, and bamboo cottages for his servants and dependents, of whom he had many. He drove in his buggy every morning to town, where he had an office with white and Chinese clerks. He owned a small fleet of schooners and native craft, and dealt in island produce on a large scale. For the rest he lived solitary, but not misanthropic, with his books and his collection, classing and arranging specimens, corresponding with entomologists in Europe, writing up a descriptive catalogue of his treasures. Such was the history of the man whom I had come to consult upon Jim's case without any definite hope. Simply to hear what he would have to say would have been a relief. I was very anxious, but I respected the intense, almost passionate absorption with which he looked at a butterfly, as though on the bronze sheen of these frail wings, in the white tracings, in the gorgeous markings, he could see other things, an image of something as perishable and defying destruction as these delicate and lifeless tissues displaying a splendor unmarred by death. "Marvelous!" he repeated, looking up at me. "Look! The beauty, but that is nothing. Look at the accuracy, the harmony, and so fragile, and so strong, and so exact. This is nature, the balance of colossal forces. Every star is so, and every blade of grass stands so, and the mighty cosmos in perfect equilibrium produces this wonder, this masterpiece of nature, the great artist." "Never heard an entomologist go on like this," I observed cheerfully. "Masterpiece, and what of man?" "Man is amazing, but he's not a masterpiece," he said, keeping his eyes fixed on the glass case. "Perhaps the artist was a little mad. Eh? What do you think? Sometimes it seems to me that man is come where he is not wanted, where there is no place for him. For if not, why should he want all the place? Why should he run about here and there, making a great noise about himself, talking about the stars, disturbing the blades of grass?" "Catching butterflies," I chimed in. He smiled, threw himself back in his chair, and stretched his legs. "Sit down," he said. "I captured this rare specimen myself one very fine morning, and I had a very big emotion. You don't know what it is for a collector to capture such a rare specimen. You can't know." I smiled at my ease in a rocking chair. His eyes seemed to look far beyond the wall at which they stared, and he narrated how, one night, a messenger arrived from his poor Mohammed, requiring his presence at the residence, as he called it, which was distant some 9 or 10 miles by a bridle path over a cultivated plain with patches of forest here and there. Early in the morning he started from his fortified house after embracing his little Emma and leaving the princess, his wife, in command. He described how she came with him as far as the gate, walking with one hand on the neck of his horse. She had on a white jacket, gold pins in her hair, and a brown leather belt over her left shoulder with a revolver in it. She talked as women will talk, he said, telling me to be careful and to try to get back before dark, and what a great wickedness it was for me to go alone. We were at war, and the country was not safe. My men were putting up bulletproof shutters to the house and loading their rifles, and she begged me to have no fear for her. She could defend the house against anybody till I returned, and I laughed with pleasure a little. I liked to see her so brave and young and strong. I too was young then. At the gate she caught hold of my hand and gave it one squeeze and fell back. I made my horse stand still outside till I heard the bars of the gate put up behind me. There was a great enemy of mine, a great noble, and a great rascal too, roaming with a band in the neighborhood. I cantered for 4 or 5 miles. There had been rain in the night, but the musts had gone up, and the face of the earth was clean. It lay smiling to me, so fresh and innocent, like a little child. Suddenly somebody fires a volley, 20 shots at least it seemed to me. I hear bullets sing in my ear, and my hat jumps to the back of my head. It was a little intrigue, you understand. They got my poor Mohammed to send for me and then laid that ambush. I see it all in a minute, and I think, this wants a little management. My pony snort, jump, and stand, and I fall slowly forward with my head on his mane. He begins to walk, and with one eye I could see over his neck a faint cloud of smoke hanging in front of a clump of bamboos to my left. I think, aha, my friends, why you not wait long enough before you shoot? This is not yet Gelungen. Oh no. I get hold of my revolver with my right hand. Quiet, quiet. After all, there were only 7 of these rascals. They get up from the grass and start running with their sarongs tucked up, waving spears above their heads and yelling to each other to look out and catch the horse, because I was dead. I let them come as close as the door here, and then bang, 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 take aim each time too. One more shot I fire at a man's back, but I miss. Too far already. And then I sit alone on my horse, with the clean earth smiling at me, and there are the bodies of 3 men lying on the ground. One was curled up like a dog, another on his back had an arm over his eyes, as if to keep off the sun, and the third man, he draws up his leg very slowly and makes it with one kick straight again. I watch him very carefully from my horse, but there is no more. Bleibt ganz ruhig. Keep still so. And as I looked at his face for some sign of life, I observed something like a faint shadow pass over his forehead. It was the shadow of this butterfly. Look at the form of the wing. This species fly high with a strong flight. I raised my eyes and I saw him fluttering away. I think, can it be possible? And then I lost him. I dismounted and went on very slow, leading my horse and holding my revolver with one hand, and my eyes darting up and down and right and left everywhere. At last I saw him sitting on a small heap of dirt 10 feet away. At once my heart began to beat quick. I let go my horse, keep my revolver in one hand, and with the other snatch my soft felt hat off my head. One step, steady. Another step, flop. I got him. When I got up, I shook like a leaf with excitement, and when I opened these beautiful wings and made sure what a rare and so extraordinary perfect specimen I had, my head went round and my legs became so weak with emotion that I had to sit on the ground. I had greatly desired to possess myself of a specimen of that species when collecting for the professor. I took long journeys and underwent great privations. I had dreamed of him in my sleep, and here suddenly I had him in my fingers, for myself. In the words of the poet, he pronounced it Boet, so halt ich's endlich denn in meinen Handen und nenn es in gewissem Sinne mein. He gave to the last word the emphasis of a suddenly lowered voice and withdrew his eyes slowly from my face. He began to charge a long-stemmed pipe busily and in silence, then, pausing with his thumb on the orifice of the bowl, looked again at me significantly. Yes, my good friend, on that day I had nothing to desire. I had greatly annoyed my principal enemy. I was young, strong, I had friendship, I had the love, he said lof, of woman, a child I had, to make my heart very full, and even what I had once dreamed in my sleep had come into my hand too. He struck a match, which flared violently. His thoughtful, placid face twitched once. Friend, wife, child, he said slowly, gazing at the small flame. Foo! The match was blown out. He sighed and turned again to the glass case. The frail and beautiful wings quivered faintly, as if his breath had for an instant called back to life that gorgeous object of his dreams. The work, he began suddenly, pointing to the scattered slips, and in his usual gentle and cheery tone, is making great progress. I have been this rare specimen describing... Na, and what is your good news? To tell you the truth, Stein, I said, with an effort that surprised me, I came here to describe a specimen. Butterfly? He asked, with an unbelieving and humorous eagerness. Nothing so perfect, I answered, feeling suddenly dispirited with all sorts of doubts. A man. Ach so, he murmured, and his smiling countenance turned to me, became grave. Then, after looking at me for a while, he said slowly, Well, I am a man too. Here you have him as he was. He knew how to be so generously encouraging as to make a scrupulous man hesitate on the brink of confidence. But if I did hesitate, it was not for long. He heard me out sitting with crossed legs. Sometimes his head would disappear completely in a great eruption of smoke, and a sympathetic growl would come out from the cloud. When I finished, he uncrossed his legs, laid down his pipe, leaned forward towards me earnestly with his elbows on the arms of his chair, the tips of his fingers together. I understand very well. He is romantic. He had diagnosed the case for me, and at first I was quite startled to find how simple it was, and indeed, our conference resembled so much a medical consultation. Stein, of learned aspect, sitting in an armchair before his desk, I, anxious, in another, facing him but a little to one side, that it seemed natural to ask, What's good for it? He lifted up a long forefinger. There is only one remedy. One thing alone can us from being ourselves cure. The finger came down on the desk with a smart rap. The case which he had made to look so simple before became, if possible, still simpler and altogether hopeless. There was a pause. Yes, said I, strictly speaking, the question is not how to get cured, but how to live. He approved with his head, a little sadly as it seemed. Ja, ja, in general, adapting the words of your great poet, that is the question. He went on, nodding sympathetically. How to be... Ah, how to be. Nay. He stood up with the tips of his fingers resting on the desk. We want in so many different ways to be, he began again. This magnificent butterfly finds a little heap of dirt and sits still on it. But man, he will never on his heap of mud keep still. He want to be so, and again he want to be so. He moved his hand up, then down. He wants to be a saint, and he wants to be a devil, and every time he shuts his eyes, he sees himself as a very fine fellow, so fine as he can never be. In a dream. He lowered the glass lid, the automatic lock clicked sharply, and taking up the case in both hands, he bore it religiously away to its place, passing out of the bright circle of the lamp into the ring of fainter light, into shapeless dusk at last. It had an odd effect, as if these few steps had carried him out of this concrete and perplexed world. His tall form, as though robbed of its substance, hovered noiselessly over invisible things with stooping and indefinite movements. His voice, heard in that remoteness where he could be glimpsed mysteriously busy with immaterial cares, was no longer incisive, seemed to roll voluminous and grave, mellowed by distance. And because you not always can keep your eyes shut, there comes the real trouble, the heart pain, the world pain. I tell you, my friend, it is not good for you to find. You cannot make your dream come true, for the reason that you not strong enough are, or not clever enough. Yah, and all the time you are such a fine fellow, too. Got him Himmel. How can that be? Ha, ha, ha. The shadow prowling amongst the graves of butterflies laughed boisterously. Yes, very funny this terrible thing is. A man that is born falls into a dream like a man who falls into the sea. If he tries to climb out into the air as inexperienced people endeavor to do, he drowns, nicht wahr? No, I tell you, the way is to the destructive element submit yourself, and with the exertions of your hands and feet in the water, make the deep, deep sea keep you up. So if you ask me, how to be? His voice leaped up extraordinarily strong, as though away there in the dusk he had been inspired by some whisper of knowledge. I will tell you, for that too there is only one way. With a hasty swish-swish of his slippers, he loomed up in the ring of faint light, and suddenly appeared in the bright circle of the lamp. His extended hand aimed at my breast like a pistol. His deep-set eyes seemed to pierce through me, but his twitching lips uttered no word, and the austere exaltation of a certitude seen in the dusk vanished from his face. The hand that had been pointing at my breast fell, and by, coming a step nearer, he laid it gently on my shoulder. There were things, he said mournfully, that perhaps could never be told, only he had lived so much alone that sometimes he forgot. He forgot. The light had destroyed the assurance which had inspired him in the distant shadows. He sat down, and with both elbows on the desk, rubbed his forehead. And yet, it is true. It is true. In the destructive element, immerse. He spoke in a subdued tone, without looking at me, one hand on each side of his face. That was the way. To follow the dream, and again to follow the dream, and so iuig usque ad finem. The whisper of his conviction seemed to open before me a vast and uncertain expanse, as of a crepuscular horizon on a plain at dawn, or was it, perchance, at the coming of the night? One had not the courage to decide, but it was a charming and deceptive light, throwing the impalpable poesy of its dimness over pitfalls, over graves. His life had begun in sacrifice, in enthusiasm for generous ideas. He had travelled very far on various ways, on strange paths, and whatever he followed it had been without faltering, and therefore without shame and without regret. In so far, he was right. That was the way, no doubt. Yet for all that, the great plain on which men wander amongst graves and pitfalls remained very desolate under the impalpable poesy of its crepuscular light, overshadowed in the centre, circled with a bright edge as if surrounded by an abyss full of flames. When at last I broke the silence, it was to express the opinion that no one could be more romantic than himself. He shook his head slowly, and afterwards looked at me with a patient and inquiring glance. It was a shame, he said. There we were sitting and talking like two boys, instead of putting our heads together to find something practical, a practical remedy for the evil, for the great evil, he repeated, with a humorous and indulgent smile. For all that, our talk did not grow more practical. We avoided pronouncing Jim's name as though we had tried to keep flesh and blood out of our discussion, or he were nothing but an erring spirit, a suffering and nameless shade. "Nah," said Stein, rising. Tonight you sleep here, and in the morning we shall do something practical. Practical. He lit a two-branched candlestick and led the way. We passed through empty, dark rooms, escorted by gleams from the lights Stein carried. They glided along the waxed floors, sweeping here and there over the polished surface of a table, leaped upon a fragmentary curve of a piece of furniture, or flashed perpendicularly in and out of distant mirrors, while the forms of two men and the flicker of two flames could be seen for a moment, stealing silently across the depths of a crystalline void. He walked slowly a pace in advance with stooping courtesy. There was a profound, as it were, a listening quietude on his face. The long, flaxen locks, mixed with white threads, were scattered thinly upon his slightly bowed neck. "He is romantic, romantic," he repeated. "And that is very bad?" "Very bad. Very good, too," he added. "But is he?" I queried. "Gewiss," he said, and stood still, holding up the candelabrum, but without looking at me. "Evident. What is it that by inward pain makes him know himself? What is it that for you and me makes him exist?" At that moment it was difficult to believe in Jim's existence. Starting from a country parsonage, blurred by crowds of men as by clouds of dust, silenced by the clashing claims of life and death in a material world. But his imperishable reality came to me with a convincing, with an irresistible force. I saw it vividly, as though in our progress through the lofty silent rooms amongst fleeting gleams of light and the sudden revelations of human figures, stealing with flickering flames within unfathomable and pellucid depths, we had approached nearer to absolute truth, which, like beauty itself, floats elusive, obscure, half-submerged in the silent, still waters of mystery. "Perhaps he is," I admitted with a slight laugh, whose unexpectedly loud reverberation made me lower my voice directly. "But I am sure you are." With his head dropping on his breast and the light held high, he began to walk again. "Well, I exist too," he said. He preceded me. My eyes followed his movements, but what I did see was not the head of the firm, the welcome guest at afternoon receptions, the correspondent of learned societies, the entertainer of stray naturalists. I saw only the reality of his destiny, which he had known how to follow with unfaltering footsteps, that life begun in humble surroundings, rich in generous enthusiasms, in friendship, love, war, in all the exalted elements of romance. At the door of my room, he faced me. "Yes," I said, as though carrying on a discussion, "and amongst other things, you dreamed foolishly of a certain butterfly. But when one fine morning your dream came in your way, you did not let the splendid opportunity escape. Did you? Whereas he—" Stein lifted his hand. "And do you know how many opportunities I let escape? How many dreams I had lost that had come in my way?" He shook his head regretfully. "It seems to me that some would have been very fine if I had made them come true. Do you know how many? Perhaps I myself don't know." "Whether his were fine or not," I said, "he knows of one which he certainly did not catch." "Everybody knows of one or two like that," said Stein, "and that is the trouble, the great trouble." He shook hands on the threshold, peered into my room under his raised arm. "Sleep well, and tomorrow we must do something practical, practical." And though his own room was beyond mine, I saw him return the way he came. He was going back to his butterflies.